Chapter 2698 Demonic Beast Soul Liu Zhen and Li Shuiqing watched all of this unfold from afar. Their faces were gleaming with joy. Half an hour has passed. No matter how lucky Han Sun is, he will have been eaten by the red blood demon by this point. Lifting the security now is pointless, Li Shuiqing said with a chuckle. I hope Exquisite isn't too upset. I'll have to think of ways to comfort her. This will surely be an open window of opportunity for me to swoop in and work my wily charms, Liu Zhen said, grinning widely. In that case, I hope you win the damsel at the end of this tale. Li Shuiqing was so happy. It felt like he had been waiting a long time to take out Han Senator. This was ointment to the long string of bad days he had recently suffered. Exquisite, let them do it. You don't know how to lift the restrictions, and you are wasting time, Open Sky Elder told Exquisite, eyeing her as she reached out to push the button. When Exquisite heard him, she retreated and quickly exclaimed, Hurry up and lift the security keeping him in. Right now, Exquisite was feeling both numb and nauseous on the inside. Even if Han Sun died, she and Li Kier could find another silkworm. It didn't have to be Han Sun, but for some reason, she didn't want to entertain the thought of finding someone else. Merely the idea made her feel dismal. I'd never find a silkworm like Han Sun again. That's why I'm feeling like this. It must be the reason. It must. Exquisite had realized that her emotions weren't very rational, and so she was desperately trying to convince herself that they were. The two inspection department men stepped forward and pushed the button. Open Sky Elder sighed and said, Han Sun was such a rare genius. It is a shame to learn he has died in a tragedy like this. Open Sky Elder was quite familiar with Jail Demon Hall and the beast it contained, and he knew that being locked inside would have been a death sentence for Han Senator. No matter how strong Han Sun was, he was half deified, and that was that. Only by depending on the powers of treasures could he manage to fight a deified being, and that was only by a small margin. Against an ordinary deified, Han Sun might have stood a chance. But the red blood demon was far from ordinary, and when it was in its rage mode, even a larva deified might not be able to kill it. Kasha, the restrictions binding the jail demon hall were deactivated. Not willing to wait a second longer, Exquisite rushed inside. She pushed open the door to jail demon hall. Open Sky Elder followed with haste, in case the red blood demon tried to rush through the open door and bring harm to the others. But when Exquisite pulled the door open, everyone's mouths gaped at the sight before them. Han Sun was standing in the middle of the room, one foot propped up atop the red blood demon's body. He was holding a great bow and using the taut string of the weapon like a saw blade. The string slid through the remaining flesh of the red blood demon's neck, and they watched in awe as the head of the red blood demon dropped to the ground with a wet thud. Exquisite and the others stood completely still. They were so flabbergasted that they barely knew how to react. Han Sun! He killed the raging red blood demon. Exquisite and Li Kier were as shocked as they were happy. Open Sky Elder and the two people from the inspection department looked at the scene with disbelief. They had a firmer grasp of how strong the red blood demon was. Han Sun was just a half deified, and he had managed to decapitate it completely. Even if Han Sun had some help from his Apollo set, this was an unbelievable feat. Liu Zhen and Li Shuiqing, who watched all of this from afar, were just as stunned. Their eyes widened, and Li Shuiqing screamed aloud. Impossible! How is that possible? How could Han Sun have killed the red blood demon? This is impossible. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The raging red blood demon had been taken down by a measly half-deified. That was far beyond anyone's wildest expectations. When Han Sun had sliced off the red blood demon's head, he heard a familiar voice ring inside his head. Mutant deified xenogenic killed, red blood demon. Xenogenic gene found. Obtained red blood demon beast soul. Han Sun didn't dare to let his mind dwell on his new acquisition. He threw the beast soul into his sea of soul without thinking about it. He had to control his thoughts very carefully to keep Exquisite and Li Kier from noticing that something was amiss. Are you okay? Exquisite asked, hurrying over to Han Senator. Although she could see that Han Sun was fine, she couldn't keep herself from asking anyway. This is nothing. Just a few wounds and scrapes, Han Sun answered, gesturing down at himself. It is great that you're okay. We were so worried about you. Why did the red blood demon go into a rage? Li Qier asked after rushing forward to see him. I actually don't know. As soon as I went inside, the red blood demon just went crazy. Its power exploded to obscene levels with no warning, Han Sen answered. But Han Sen didn't explain how he had managed to defeat the red blood demon. He just said he had been fortunate, and that he had to use all of his power to win. His victory basically boiled down to luck, though. Luck, huh? Open Sky Elder looked at Han Sen with interest. He wasn't the sort of person that believed in luck. The raging red blood demon wasn't something that could be overcome through dumb luck. But Open Sky Elder didn't push the subject any further. He only asked about the raging red blood demon. He needed to figure out why the red blood demon had gone wild. After answering a few more questions, Han Sen left with Exquisite and Li Qier. He finally found some time alone to check out the red blood demon beast soul. Mutant red blood demon beast soul. Demonic beast soul. Incomplete. Han Sen's eyebrows rose. This was the first time he had seen a demonic beast soul before. Also, like the Tianxia Peacock King beast soul, the red blood demon beast soul was an incomplete beast soul. He didn't know what additional strength the complete versions might offer. So, what exactly is a demonic beast soul, I wonder? Han Sen thought as he summoned it. The next second, Han Sen felt as if some scary power was washing over him. His entire body brimmed with a blood-red power. Crimson light started to leak out of his skin. Many substance chains exploded throughout his cells, changing him as they went. Soon, visible changes began to occur across Han Sen's skin. Under the influence of the light and substance chains, Han Sen's skin hardened like a shell. The red color coming from him looked just like the red blood demon. In a flash, his entire body was encased inside that protective shell. The more Han Sen grew to look like the red blood demon, the more his presence increased. Red substance chains swirled restlessly around him. This is like a shape-shifting beast soul, but it is a bit different. Transfusion shape-shifting beast souls transform my body to look like the creatures that the beast souls originally belonged to. This demonic beast soul reinforces my body as well, however. I'm basically half human and half demon, Han Sen murmured to himself, trying to get a sense for exactly how the beast soul worked. He was very pleased with his prize. Despite the change in Han Sen's appearance, the demonic beast soul wouldn't turn him into a xenogeniac. He would have both the red blood demon's power and his own human power. In demon mode, I would probably have enough power to fight the red blood demon reliably. So even if I ran into the red blood demon again, I wouldn't have such a hard time. Han Sen tried to explore the breadth of the beast soul's power. The demonic power it wielded was greater than Han Sen had expected. He liked it more and more. But what does the incomplete part mean? Does that mean the Peacock King beast soul and the red blood demon beast soul can still be upgraded? If so, how do I make them complete beast souls? Han Sen thought to himself. Chapter 2699 Fish in a Bottle. The incident in Jail Demon Hall had yet to be explained. Although it was suggested that the raging of the red blood demon might have been somehow connected to the blood marrow geno fluid, the inspection department came to no ultimate conclusion. And before the incident, no one had known that the bone marrow geno fluid could produce this sort of effect. The warehouse frequently offered that type of geno fluid when they ran out of the ordinary ones. So it all seemed like one giant coincidence. No one should have been responsible for what occurred. But Han Sen thought things couldn't have been that simple. He firmly believed the event had something to do with Liu Zhen and Li Shuecheng. Li Shuecheng had visited him not long before the lockdown took place. The timing was too suspicious to be a coincidence. But there was no evidence linking the event to Li Shuecheng, and that meant Han Sen could not do anything to the man. It is a shame that the red blood demon doppelganger will take another 6 months to regenerate. Otherwise I could go and kill it again. Maybe that would help me figure out what an incomplete beast soul is. Han Sen thought to himself as he fished at Underworld Lake. Then he heard Bauer's voice shouting to him, interrupting his thoughts. Dad, I fished up the sheep head again. Bauer yelled as she pulled at the underworld silk. Han Sen looked toward her and saw that she was indeed pulling the 4-sheep cube toward her. Half of it was visible through the clouds of the lake. Han-sun had gotten used to this happening. Bauer frequently caught the 4-sheep cube on the end of her line, but she was never able to bring it out of the lake. Indeed, whenever the 4-sheep cube was on the cusp of being pulled free of the lake's surface, the underworld silk tended to snap. The 4-sheep cube would sink below the white mists again. After fishing it up so many times without actually being able to catch it, Bauer was starting to get angry. As she watched the 4-sheep cube again, waiting for the moment it fell back into the lake, she decided to try something new. With her free hand, she summoned her little gourd. She aimed the gourd at the sinking 4-sheep cube. Then Bauer tapped the top of the gourd, unleashing a weird power. It was like an invisible lasso had been slung over the 4-sheep cube. It yanked the 4-sheep cube in the direction of the little gourd. Han-sun looked at Bauer with shock. The things in Underworld Lake were very special, and generally, only strings made of underworld silk could affect them. Other powers didn't really do anything in Underworld Lake. Until an item left Underworld Lake completely, no types of power should have worked on it. Han-sun had already tried using his own powers to remove the 4-sheep cube from the lake, but it hadn't worked. If his power touched the surface of Underworld Lake, the mist would disrupt and render it null. But the little gourd's power of suction didn't seem to be affected at all by the lake. It easily pulled the 4-sheep cube up and away. Unfortunately, Bauer didn't have enough raw power, and she seemed to be struggling to pull the statue free of the clouds. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but it felt like the 4-sheep cube was using its own strength to pull itself back into the lake. It was trying to return to the camouflage of the clouds. Bauer gripped her little gourd tightly, and the weight of the statue slowly began to drag her little body toward Underworld Lake. Han-sun's heartbeat sped up, and he teleported over beside her and grabbed hold of her. Han-sun sensed that a foreign power had wrapped itself around Bauer's body, and it was towing both of them toward the lake. What a scary power! Han-sun's face paled slightly. He didn't have time to think, so he simply summoned his Peacock King Soul Robe and used all of his power to remain still. His legs dug into the lakeside soil. It wasn't enough. Not even the powerful beast's soul could prevent the malevolent force from pulling him closer to the lake. Han-sun's legs slowly tore a trench through the soil as he was dragged toward the lake. Han-sun and Bauer used all of their strength, and Bauer's face flushed a deep red. But she couldn't fight off that power no matter how hard she tried, and she was on the verge of falling into the lake. Han-sun was about to tell Bauer to put away the little gourd, but he suddenly felt a new power latch onto him from behind. The powerful force launched them backward, almost yanking the 4-sheep cube clear of the mist. Han-sun looked behind, and with much shock, he saw that it was the 16 little pigs. They had all lined up single file, with each pig biting the tail of the next one in line. The little pig in front was biting Han-sun's soul robe, pulling him back. Mysterious spellwork glowed on the forehead of each little pig, and a strange power was spreading amongst them. Han-sun was shocked. This level of power should have been far out of reach for a mere king-class being. Even after donning his Tianxia Peacock King Soul Robe, Han-sun had still been pulled toward the lake. But the 16 little pigs were holding on just fine. That was a bit weird. Han-sun didn't put too much thought into it though. After all, he and Bauer had been putting all of their strength into the effort. Perhaps they had only needed a tiny bit more power, and it just so happened to be provided by the 16 little pigs. The little creatures probably weren't that strong. The 4-sheep cube was on the verge of being pulled out of the lake, and Han-sun could see the faces of the bronze sheep above the clouds. They almost appeared frightened. Very good. Let's pull you up so I can see what the hell you are. Realizing that their tug-of-war with the 4-sheep cube was almost over, Han-sun started to get excited. Every time they had failed to pull the statue free, the sheep heads had mocked him. That had always upset Han-senator the moment the 4-sheep cube was lifted from the lake. Han-sun felt the tension on his hands loosen. Suddenly, Bauer and the little pigs were all flying backward. Pang! The 3 to 4 meter high 4-sheep cube came flying out of the clouds. It landed on the soil, one of its corners digging into the ground. Grass and soil sprayed everywhere, showering Han-sun and Bauer. Ah, I finally got you out. So what on earth are you? Han-sun merrily exclaimed. He lifted himself off the ground and approached the 4-sheep cube. Bauer and the little pigs came up to see it too. Han-sun, Bauer, and the little pigs surrounded the four-sheep cube. After walking around, Han-sun confirmed that the four-sheep cube was an ordinary bronze statue. He couldn't sense any life force or power coming from it. It seemed dead and inanimate. Han-sun looked at the four sheep heads, but their faces all looked the same. They had lowered eyebrows and half-closed eyes. They looked like frozen monks. They didn't seem to be mocking anyone. Weird. I swear I saw different expressions on their faces. Why aren't they changing now? Han-sun used his purple-eye butterfly to have a look, but he couldn't see anything strange about the statue. The purple-eye butterfly's rewinding power didn't work on it either. Is this thing dead or alive? Han-sun wondered aloud, searching carefully for some sign of power from the statue. Despite its lack of response, Han-sun didn't believe that the statue was an ordinary bronze object. Han-sun reached out his hand to tap his fist against the side of the four-sheep cube. The action produced a dong-dong noise. The statue didn't look damaged at all. When Han-sun saw that, he became certain that this was no ordinary piece of bronze. With his power, even treasures made from king-class xenogenic genes would break if he struck them. But the four-sheep cube was totally fine. That meant the material was special. Bauer jumped over to the four-sheep cube to get a better look. She said in surprise, "Dad, there are two fish." "Fish?" Han-sun asked. He flew to the top of the four-sheep cube and lowered his head to get a better view of the top of the four-sheep cube. It was full of water, and there were two goldfish inside. They were black and white. Chapter 2700 Sea Palace. Their heads were like those of a Buddha, and their tails spread like butterfly wings. Their bodies were really fat and round. Other than their black and white coloring, they looked a little like lion-head goldfish. They were swimming calmly around inside the four-sheep cube, undisturbed by their rough exodus from Underworld Lake. Bauer was squatting near the four-sheep cube. She put her hand down into the water, wanting to touch the fish. The fish were only a few inches below the surface of the water. She put her arm into the water up to her shoulder, but still, she couldn't touch those two goldfish. Han-sun frowned. He pulled out his ghost teeth knife and thrust at the white fish below the water. The white fish was so close to the surface of the water, but when Han-sun thrust the knife in, the blade sank completely into the water without getting any closer to the white goldfish. The two fish inside didn't seem to know what was going on. They continued swimming around slowly. Han-sun frowned. Ghost teeth knife generated a dangerous knife air that flew into the water once more. While that demonic-looking Fong knife air was capable of tearing through the fabric of space, it was unable to touch the white goldfish. The white goldfish was still swimming around slowly. It didn't seem even remotely shaken by Han-sun's attacks. And the few inches of water above it was like the length of an entire solar system. No matter how scary Han-sun's knife air was, it couldn't go through the water to touch the fish inside. This four-sheep cube is so weird, Han-sun thought to himself. He reached out, grabbing the cube and toppling it onto its side. Water began pouring out of the top of the statue. Water burst out like a flooded river overrunning its banks. The water poured out so quickly that it looked like it was going to form another lake. But the water level within the cube didn't seem like it was being reduced. What is this thing? Han-sun thought, disturbed. The four-sheep cube was far too strange. Not even he could see or understand what it was. If the statue was deified, it was still strange that Han-sun couldn't get a power reading from it. And if it was just an ordinary object, it shouldn't have been able to hold an ocean's worth of water. Han-sun was lost in thought, so he didn't immediately notice that Bauer had climbed to the top of one of the bronze sheep heads. She used her foot to stomp on it. Clearly, Bauer was more than capable of holding a grudge. She remembered each and every time the sheep had mocked her as they fell back into the lake of clouds. So, she wanted to step on the heads of the sheep to unleash the anger she had been harboring all that time. But when she started stomping the head, she heard a catcha-catcha noise. The sheep head had been raised, but it was pushed down by Bauer's furious blows. The sheep head was lowered, as if it was about to take a bite of grass. Bauer was shocked by this too. She hadn't thought the four-sheep cube was fragile enough to break after being stomped on. Han-sun jerked his head up, immediately noticing the strange scene. The bronze sheep head had been stomped down by Bauer, but the other three heads were still raised. An ominous feeling rolled through Han Sen's stomach. Before, when he struck the statue, he thought it was a very hard object. He had been unable to leave a single mark on the object. Bauer, however, had almost broken one of the heads when she stomped on it twice. If Bauer didn't use some special power to do that, then the cube. Before Han Sen could finish his thought, he saw the swimming goldfish suddenly accelerate. As the two goldfish swam, the water started to splosh and spin until a whirlpool formed. Han Sen realized this was bad. He grabbed Bauer and turned to teleport away. He wanted to get as far away from the four-sheep cube as he could, but after picking up Bauer, he realized he was too late. A powerful force of suction reached out of the cube and grabbed him and Bauer. They fell into the whirlpool and quickly sank. The 16 pigs got pulled in as well. They were spun around inside the whirlpool alongside Han Sen and Bauer. Han Sen held on to Bauer as he tried to escape, but the world around him had turned into chaos. When he finally managed to regain control of himself and pull himself out of the water, he froze. The four-sheep cube sat quietly beside him, and the two goldfish were once more swimming placidly through the water. The vortex had disappeared, and the sheep head that Bauer had stomped on looked ordinary again. Just like the other three sheep heads, it was raised. Its eyebrows were lowered, and its eyes were half open. It looked as if nothing had happened. The 16 small piggies emerged from the water too. They lay on the frame of the cube as they shook the water off of their skin. Nothing seemed to have changed, but the environment around them was completely different. Han Sen and the others had been on the shore of Underworld Lake only moments before, but now they were someplace else. As he looked around, Han Sen didn't even think that they were still in outer sky. They were standing near a range of palaces. Unlike the palaces that could be found in outer sky, however, these palaces hadn't been constructed atop mountains. Rather, they were built across the surface of a nearby sea. All kinds of different palaces stood across the seemingly endless sea. They were like islands, spread out across an infinite ocean. This place wasn't anywhere to be found in outer sky. What is this place? Han Sen looked around. Aside from the palaces, there was nothing much to see. There didn't seem to be any living beings around either. The sea below them looked infinitely deep, but it wasn't like an ordinary sea. The sea wasn't blue. It was transparent like a crystal, and there were no waves. The water looked strangely quiet and still. Dad, the sun is weird. Bauer lifted a finger to point at the sun in the sky. She looked at it with curiosity. Han Sen hadn't noticed the sun, but now that Bauer was pointing her finger at it, he looked and became just as shocked. The sun was releasing light and heat, but it was so weird. Even calling it a sun was something of a misnomer. It was more like a clock in the sky. The clock face held 3 needles, varying in length and thickness, which obviously represented seconds, minutes, and hours. Although there were no numbers on the clock, the position of the needles seemed to be showing that it was 12 o'clock. A palace on a sea of silent water, where the sun is a clock. What kind of place have we come to? Han Sen thought warily. He didn't trust this place. The palaces floated calmly on the surface of the sea, although nothing seemed to be holding them aloft. Even the four-sheep cube was floating unaided on the surface. Everything around them was so quiet. Since they had arrived, Han Sen hadn't noticed a single sound or movement from their surroundings. The 2 goldfish inside the cube were swimming. They seemed to be playing in the water. As he looked around at the palaces spread across the sea, Han Sen wondered what he should do next. But as he did, he suddenly heard a sound from far away. Dong! 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 In that moment, the air was filled with the sound of tolling bells. Han Sen turned his head up to the sky to get a look at the sun clock. The 3 needles on the sun were pointing to the very top. For a normal clock, that either would mean it was 12 a.m. or 12 p.m. Chapter 27, One Giant Prisoners. The sound of the tolling bells echoed across the vast ocean. It was extremely strange to hear so much sound in a place that had previously been so dead. 5 times, 6 times. Han Sen was silently counting each chime. He counted all the way to 12, then the bells fell quiet. The moment the bells stopped, the doors of every palace opened wide. Some of the buildings looked like modern metal structures, while others were crafted like vintage castles. Regardless of their appearances, all of the palaces opened their doors at the same time, as if they had been rigged to do so automatically. When the palace doors opened up, a sense of life came to the previously dead and barren ocean. Han Sen could even hear footsteps echoing from the nearest palace. Even a person who was almost deaf could have heard those booming footsteps. Each one was like a small earthquake, and the sounds pressed against Han Sen's eardrums like a physical weight. Those earthquake-like footsteps drew Han Sen's gaze toward the palace's door, and he soon saw something massive emerging through the open door frame. It was a giant that was 100 meters tall. Although it was big, it didn't seem clumsy or awkward. Instead, it moved its massive body with grace, exuding a sense of explosive power with every motion. If the being wished to, Han Sen figured it could cast power with enough strength and speed to destroy an entire planet with ease. Han Sen's brows furrowed as he noticed the manacles attached to the giant's hands and legs. It gave him the sense that this was a prisoner of some notoriety. The giant's eyes looked very dull, and it just stared forward into space. Han Sen quickly realized that the giant he was watching wasn't the only one that had emerged. A giant now stood in front of every palace across that entire ocean. All the other giants were bound hand and foot as well, and their eyes were lifeless. They stood quietly in front of their respective buildings. They have such large bodies. They aren't sinking, despite the fact that they're standing on the surface of the sea. The current seems to be moving them though. They're all being pulled in the same direction. Han Sen hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should follow and see what was up, as all of this seemed like weird nonsense. Outer sky shouldn't have allowed a foreign object to conduct space teleportation. But the four-sheep cube had brought them effortlessly to this strange sea. Han Sen had visited too many weird places in his time. So, even though this place was very strange, Han Sen wasn't too shaken. What caught him off guard, however, was the presence of those giants. There was an incredible gravitas to the presence of the giants, and it made Han Sen wonder if they were deified elites. But as Han Sen thought about it, he realized that he could see 200 or 300 of the giants. If they were all deified elites, he couldn't imagine what race they must have represented to have so many deified elites in their ranks. Even more frightening, these power giants were being treated like prisoners. Their limbs were chained, and something was wrong with their eyes. Who could have imprisoned giants like these? Han Sen wanted to go and find out, but he concluded that it would be too dangerous. If something had been able to trap those giants, it could likely detect Han Sen's presence, especially if he went looking for it. Never mind. Let's just find a way to leave this creepy place. Han Sen picked up Bauer and returned to the four-sheep cube. You aren't going to go see? Bauer asked, looking at the giants that were drifting away on the currents. It's too dangerous. For now, let's just figure out a way to get out of here. Han Sen answered with a shake of his head. He walked over to the four-sheep cube. He remembered Bauer stepping on one of the sheep heads, which triggered the whirlpool that had brought them to this place. Now we have to take a risk. Han Sen directed the small pigs to go back into the pool of water in the four-sheep cube. He picked up Bauer and jumped in after them, but not before stepping on one of the bronze sheep heads. Catcha! When Han Sen's foot came down on the bronze sheep head, the two goldfish started to swim around like mad again. The water in the cube became a whirlpool once more. We must go back. Han Sen once more felt a magnetic force emanating from the cube. He and Bauer were sucked into the cube and its whirlpool. The 16 little piggies were spinning around inside like mad too. When the water flow stopped, and Han Sen emerged from the cube, he realized with pleasant surprise that they were back on the shores of Underworld Lake. Is the four-sheep cube a teleporter? If that is the case, I wonder where it sent us. And what were those giants? Han Sen looked at the four-sheep cube as he mulled these questions over. He continued to think to himself, saying, This bronze sheep head gives me the ability to teleport. I wonder what the other 3 sheep heads do. Does each one provide a different function? Or will the others send me to different places? Han Sen gave the matter some thought. His curiosity regarding the object had increased immensely, but he didn't want to take too many risks. If his instincts were correct, those giants were deifieds. And if that was true, wherever they were going had to be very dangerous. Based on that assumption, Han's son imagined that the other 3 bronze sheep heads would lead him to someplace else that was dangerous too. Despite all his strengths and talents, Han's son had a flaw. He could be too curious. He knew how dangerous that sea filled with giants could be. But now that he had discovered such a weird and mysterious place, it would drive him insane if he didn't go and find out its secrets. Bauer, you stay here. Han's son set Bauer down, planning to visit the giant world alone. Dad, I'll go with you. Bauer clutched Han's son's leg, not wanting to let go. That place is too dangerous. I will go and scout ahead. If it looks fun, I will take you there. Han's son had to comfort Bauer for a while before she agreed to stay behind. Han's son took Bauer someplace far away, before returning to the 4-sheep cube. He used his hand to press down on the sheep head. Just like before, the 2 goldfish in the water started to swim in a swift circle. They created a whirlpool in the water that sucked Han's son inside. When Han's son emerged from the 4-sheep cube, he found himself standing atop that big sea again. The giants had all disappeared. He looked at the sun, and the clock was showing that only a dozen minutes had passed. Boom! Han's son suddenly heard a massive explosion come from where the giants had gone. He could feel the spike of power coming from that direction. As the power shook the air around him, Han's son's face changed. He whispered to himself in a hoarse voice, "That shockwave. It feels like Break 6 skies." Are these giants the legendary Break skies? Break 6 skies was the secret Geno art of the Break skies. The destroyed were one of the few races with the blood of the Break skies in them, but they were never as good as the Break skies themselves. The legends of the universe claimed that the Break skies were unable to breed, so the universe gradually forgot them. If they wanted to extend their bloodline, they had to interbreed with other races to create hybrid Break skies, like the destroyed. If these giants really were Break skies, then the story of the Breakski's fall wasn't as simple as it initially seemed. Chapter 2702 Giants move mountains without hesitation. Han's son followed the waves of the sea. He flew in the direction they were coming from. He didn't dare to teleport though. He merely reduced his presence as much as he could and flew slowly. Because teleportation caused ripples in the fabric of space, elites were likely to pick up on such a technique if he used it. That could allow the people he was tailing to notice his presence, which he was trying very hard to avoid advertising. It was better for Han's son to fly in as slowly and quietly as he could. He wouldn't draw as much attention that way. Boom, 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 boom. Explosions sounded one after another. The strong shockwaves they emitted let Han's son confirm that it really was the power of Break 6 skies. He had practiced Break 6 skies before, but he had never used it to create anything as powerful as the shockwaves that were now rolling by him. Whoever was using Break 6 skies right now was far stronger than he was, that was for sure. Are those giants really Break skies? What are they doing here? Han's son was growing more and more suspicious of this whole situation. He wanted to teleport forward to get there with greater haste and see what they were doing. The hyper-scary Break 6 skies shockwaves might have suggested an obscenely dangerous battle was going on. But Han's son couldn't feel any other powers or Geno arts being used. If the giants were fighting some other group, Han's son should have been able to detect some evidence of foreign powers. Are the giants killing each other maybe? Although Han's son wanted to find out the truth, he still remained patient and flew forward slowly. He was careful not to rush. The sea sloshed and danced like mad with the energy that was being released. Han's son flew between the wild waves, figuring they were a perfect opportunity to hide and remain out of sight. This sea was unimaginably weird. Han's son had flown for dozens of miles, yet he hadn't seen a single piece of seaweed or ocean creature. This sea was like distilled water, man-made, and without a single speck of bacteria. The palaces that floated on the surface were now far behind Han's senator. He had passed 300 of them as he flew forward, but that seemed to be all that there were. If each palace contained a giant, then that means there are 300 giants here. That is so many defied elites. That's almost as glorious as the legends I've heard of sacred. What kind of people could have trapped these guys? Han's son was growing increasingly worried about this strange situation he had stumbled into. Eventually, Han's son saw a big mountain appear over the horizon. That mountain quickly swelled to block his vision as he flew toward it. It looked massive. The giants, who were possibly break skies, had gathered at the foothills of the mountain. They were all swinging their fists to wall up the mountain. Han Sen had been waiting for this moment. The shockwaves of their blows rushed over him, and he confirmed the nature of the power. It really was break six skies. But what surprised Han Sen was that they weren't fighting. They were using break six skies to excavate the rocks of the mountain. 300 giants, all in tight manacles, were like prisoners condemned to a mining camp. They punched the mountain, breaking away pieces of rock with a slow, steady rhythm. The mountain looked gray, and Han Sen had no idea what sort of stone it was. Even though the giants were unleashing an insane amount of power as they worked, they only created a hole the size of one of their fists with each strike. The 300 giants swung their fists with the implacability of machines, but the mountain was simply too massive. When the giants' progress was measured against the immensity of their task, it was obvious that they were barely making any headway. What are these guys doing? It isn't as if they're collecting the stones. Their punches are pretty much destroying the rocks, so they can't be after the stone itself. Han Sen eyed the mountain curiously. Han Sen continued flying, checking out the nearby area. Aside from that huge mountain and 300 giants, Han Sen didn't see anything else of note. There was just water in every direction. Han Sen inched closer to the mountain, but he did not dare get too close. He was worried there might be creatures lurking about that he couldn't detect. He spent a while watching the giants, but even after a considerable amount of time, he couldn't understand what the giants were doing. Are these guys the heirs of Yugong? Are all of his children here, moving this mountain? Or does the mountain possess some kind of treasure? Han Sen wondered with interest. Han Sen examined the mountain more closely. God knew how long the 300 giants had been working there. They had only removed a small part of the mountain's foothills. If they were trying to make a tunnel, it would take years. The way they're striking seems like they're trying to move the mountain, not dig into the side of it, Han Sen thought with a frown. He decided that he should fly around the mountain. Perhaps he could find some piece of text carved into the mountain, or really anything that might shed light on this baffling situation. Han Sen hadn't flown very far around the mountain when his eyes widened. He came to an abrupt stop. A giant metal pillar had been pushed into the side of the mountain. It looked something like the Sky God pillar, actually. Even more strangely, the metal pillar had been rammed through the chest of a giant. It was pinning him to the mountain. That giant looked stronger than the other 300 break skies that Han Sen had seen so far. Its armor was crusted with dull, dried blood. Its blood-matted white hair looked like a waterfall, but it also obscured the giant's face. What did he look like? Han Sen had no idea. Han Sen couldn't sense a life force within this massive creature, but he could definitely sense a presence. It was hard to describe. When Han Sen looked at the giant, he felt numb. Goosebumps flared across his skin. The giant was a dead man pinned to a mountain, but Han Sen felt as if his presence could break the sun and the moon. It was like the sky and the ground would be forced to obey this monster. How can a dead man have this much power? How strong had he once been then? Han Sen's shock quickly gave way to confusion. Are these giants trying to move the mountain so they can bring this body down? That is so stupid. Wouldn't it be easier to dig around the lance itself? If they follow their current path, they'll have to dig through almost the entire mountain in order to bring the body down. Han Sen couldn't understand what the giants were thinking, and so he continued soaring around the mountain to see if he could find anything else. He ended up disappointed. He flew around the mountain, but aside from the pillar and the giant corpse pinned to the mountain, there was nothing else to find. The giants have to be after that body, but the way they're digging into the rocks makes no sense. There must be a reason why they cannot bring the body down right away, Han Sen thought to himself. Han Sen spent a long time watching them from afar. The giants kept using their fists to shatter stone. They did it with reprieve. Han Sen made a calculation. At their current speed, it would take more than 10,000 years for them to bring the whole mountain down. Dong! 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 The bells in the sky rang again. Han Sen raised his head. The 3 needles were pointing north again. That meant it was 12 o'clock. Upon hearing the bell, the giants striking the mountain stopped their work. They all turned and headed back the way they had come. When the giants were gone, Hansen saw something unbelievable. Chapter 27:03 Horizontal Evil. The mountain that the giants had just been digging was slowly growing back. Every hole created by the fist of a giant refilled, and the mountain itself actually expanded. Hansen froze in place as he saw this. To make sure he was seeing this correctly, Hansen remained where he was for a while. The craters that the giants had made were becoming smaller and smaller. That meant his eyes weren't going funny. The mountain really was growing. Buzz! Hansen was staring at it when he suddenly heard a high-pitched sonic sound. When that sound hit his eardrums, Hansen's head became all blurry. He clutched his skill and tumbled down. He fell into the sea. Hansen quickly cast a power to deflect that frightening sonic power. He felt a bit better, but his head was still ringing. He couldn't completely block the sound. Fighting his way back out of the water wasn't easy. His head had only just reached the surface when he could hear that sound clearly again. He realized that the sounds were actually coming from the metal pillar. The metal pillar spun like a drill bit, and the patterns across the metal pillar shone with a weird light. The light spun with the metal pillar, carving into the scary giant's chest. Blood poured from the wound, splashing over the giant's armor and hair. The blood left red streaks over everything that it touched. Hansen only now realized that the giant's armor wasn't actually red. It had simply been dyed red by the blood pouring out of him. Blood had clearly been soaking into the giant's hair for a long time as well. Only the upper portions of the creature's hair had avoided the blood spray and maintained their silver-white color. Hansen had thought the giant, impaled body was simply a corpse. However, as the metal pillar spun, Hansen could sense the body trembling. It looked as if it was suffering unimaginable pain. That guy is alive. Hansen was in shock. Who are you? Why are you here? Hansen was thinking to himself. But then he heard a sound. The metal pillar was still drilling brutally into the giant's chest. But with a thunderous noise, the frightening creature turned its head to look toward Hansen. Its eyes peered at Hansen through the unkempt hair. Although the giant was only looking at him, it made Hansen feel extremely unsettled. The gaze was so intense that it almost felt like it was burning him. The scary giant's voice shook while it spoke. It seemed as if it was suffering. Hansen couldn't imagine what the giant must be feeling at that moment. It would be worried if having a drill pushed into your chest wasn't excruciatingly painful. Who are you? And why are you here? Hansen flew backward out of the water. He tried to put some distance between himself and the giant, so he retreated to a careful distance before he spoke. The scary giant continued to stare at Hansen. He didn't look away. After a while he said, "If you were able to come here, shouldn't you know who I am?" "Why would I know who you are?" Hansen asked, once he had fallen back a little further from the giant. The scary giant looked shocked, and then he laughed. "If you don't know who I am, then that is great. That means you don't know who Sacred Leader is." "You are Sacred Leader?" Hansen was shocked. He looked at the giant with sheer disbelief. When the giant heard Hansen ask that, he looked shocked as well. He looked at Hansen with a strange expression, and he didn't speak. It was like he was trying to figure something out. When the giant fell silent, Hansen asked again, "Who are you? Why have you been pinned to the mountain?" The scary giant gave Hansen a conflicted look. He said, "I am the Breaksky Alpha." Although he was pinned to a mountain and enduring torture, the scary giant sounded extremely proud when he said those words. It was like the whole universe had reason to look up to him, all because of that one simple fact. "You are the Alpha of the Breakskys? These giants are really Breakskys then?" Although Hansen had already guessed as much, hearing the scary giant admit he was one of the Breakskys still came as a bit of a shock. "Yes, the others are all Breakskys too." The Breaksky Alpha froze and asked Hansen, "Who are you?" "Hansen, I am a nobody crystallizer," Hansen said, trying to be polite. "Since when have the crystallizers developed bodies like yours?" The Breaksky's Alpha looked at Hansen, but his face was impassive, and his thoughts remained hidden. "I think you have been locked up for too long, and as a result, you don't know what has been going on in the wider world outside. The crystallizers are different these days." Hansen then cocked his head to the side and asked, "Why are you locked up here? Why aren't your people saving you?" You are right. This is no longer the era of the break skies. The break sky alpha sighed and said, if they hadn't tried to save me, they wouldn't be locked up here forever and forced to dig through a mountain each and every day. Who was able to trap you here? Was it Sacred Leader? Hansen asked. The break sky alpha had mentioned Sacred Leader earlier, so perhaps there was a connection between the two of them. Break sky alpha shook his head. He started to say something more, but then his expression changed. He told Hansen, quick, hide in my hair, or you will be dead. Hansen had already noticed that something wasn't right. Even the black crystal armor was releasing a sense indicating imminent danger. The break sky alpha wasn't lying. Hansen's body flashed away. He flew up to the alpha's shoulder, then climbed into the giant's hair. No matter what happens, you cannot release a single speck of your presence, the break sky alpha murmured. He stopped talking and turned to stare coldly up into the sky. Hansen buried himself in the giant's hair and reduced the sense of his presence. The black crystal armor released some weird sort of power that locked down his body. Hansen's aura vanished until he couldn't even detect his own presence. Suddenly, Hansen felt a ripple flow through the space above them. Hansen looked into the sky, and he saw something emerging from the area next to the sun clock. When he saw the shape of the descending body, Hansen almost screamed. It was King Jun, the being he had seen on planet Eclipse long ago. After he was injured, Hansen hadn't seen him again. He couldn't believe he was seeing him again here, of all places. Horizontal evil, have you given this some thought? King Jun was wearing gold armor and a gold helmet. He looked like a god king in the sky. His eyes were like lightning as they looked at the scary giant. It looks like your wounds have almost healed, and yet you have time to waste here every day. If you have so much time, why don't you try to find out who attacked you and made you like this? The scary giant said. Rather than being angered, King Jun replied with a voice full of cool spite. Horizontal evil, do you really want to be trapped here for all eternity? Do you want to see your people try to save you without rest? Chapter 2704 God Area. Even if you can endure the pain of this impaling punishment, are you willing to watch your people toil pointlessly for the rest of their lives? Do you want them to suffer in this place like a group of shambling corpses? King Jun looked down at the scary giant from high above. He looked like he was on cloud 9. Horizontal evil was suffering constant torture, but he still managed to laugh. Even if everyone abandons me, neither the living nor the dead will accept the break skies. So what does it matter? Do you guys want Super Gene? Well, I'm not giving it to anyone. Hansen caught his breath when he heard that. Finally, another mention of the elusive Super Gene. King Jun's face didn't change. He looked at Horizontal Evil calmly and said, you are sacrificing yourself and your people for Sacred Leader's most treasured secret. Is it truly worth the cost? You are being tortured here. Did you not notice? All of your fellow break skies are going to die here with you. Where is Sacred Leader now? Did he ever express any desire to save you? Has he ever done anything for the break skies? You don't have to keep talking. No one will extract any of Super Gene's secrets from me. Sky Armor failed before, and you, King Jun? You will fail as well. Try harder, Horizontal said mockingly to his oppressor. King Jun laughed at Horizontal Evil. He didn't lose his cool as a result of Horizontal Evil's taunting. With his holier-than-thou attitude firmly in place, he said, I have all the time in the world. You should take your own time and think about it some more. However, I have come to visit you, because there is something I wish to tell you. I'm going away for a while. When I come back, I will give you a small gift. It will surprise you, and I think you should look forward to it. What is that supposed to mean? Horizontal Evil asked with a frown. You will know it when you see it. And I assure you, you will be very surprised. A weird smirk crossed King Jun's face. He then turned around, flew toward that sun that looked like a clock, and disappeared. After a while, Horizontal Evil spoke to Hansen in a gravelly voice. You can come out now. Hansen rose out of Horizontal Evil's hair, feeling relieved. Fortunately, King Jun had remained unaware of Hansen's presence through the entire conversation. God only knew what might have happened if his presence had been disclosed. After King Jun left, the black crystal armor returned to its dormant state as well. The alarms he was receiving from his senses and nerves gradually went quiet. You are only king class. How did you get here? Horizontal evil asked Han Senator to him. Half deifieds and kings were the same. There was no distinction between them. Han Sen told him about the four-sheep cube, and after Horizontal Evil heard Han Sen's explanation, he frowned. That means the four-sheep cube is a treasure that comes from the anti-material world. That is certainly quite strange. Perhaps that is the reason it sent you here. What kind of place is this? And who is that man? Han Sen asked. Horizontal Evil didn't answer Han Senator instead. He asked a question of his own. Tell me about what is going on in the universe right now. Remaining patient, Han Sen began to describe the state of the universe these days. Horizontal Evil listened to every word and asked a lot of questions. His face grew more and more concerned as the discussion went on. Horizontal Evil eventually looked up at the sun in the sky and gestured for Han Sen to stop talking. My time is almost up. You should come back tomorrow. Han Sen was going to continue, but he then heard the bells chime. He raised his head and noticed that 12 whole hours had gone by. The metal pillar stopped spinning, and its lights faded away. It returned to looking like a simple metal pole. Horizontal Evil's eyes slowly closed, and he looked as if he had slipped into a deep sleep. No matter how Han Sen tried to wake him, there was no response. Not long after, Han Sen heard the brake guys headed toward him. They didn't see Han Sen, and they got back to digging that mountain. When Han Sen saw this again, he felt a sharp pang of sympathy in his heart. It was upsetting to see what they were forced to do, now that he had learned more. These brake guys try to dig into the mountain every day. They are trying to save their alpha. But it is a task that they will never fully accomplish. Whoever set this up is unimaginably evil. Killing them would have been simple, but he wanted them to suffer this painful existence for the rest of their lives. It is quite scary to think about. Han Sen sighed. He didn't stay there any longer. He flew back to the four-sheep cube. When he returned to Underworld Lake, he found Bauer and the 16 piggies waiting there. They were all looking at Han Sen when he came back. Exquisite and Liqueur didn't show up while I was absent. Han Sen asked, picking up Bauer. No. Bauer shook her head. Han Sen nodded. That was one less thing to worry about. He tried putting the four-sheep cube inside Destiny's tower, and he was able to slide it inside without difficulty. He let out a sigh of relief. If I have another chance in the future, I will go and visit that Horizontal Evil. Maybe I can get some secrets out of him. Going by what King Jun had to say, it seems Horizontal Evil has a fairly firm connection to Sacred Leader, Han Sen thought to himself. He then proceeded to think about how he might pry some more secrets from Horizontal Evil. That wouldn't be an easy task. Horizontal Evil had been there for years, and he hadn't divulged his secrets to his tormentor, who was practically a god. Han Sen, on the other hand, was just a mere stranger. Building any semblance of trust between the two of them would be very difficult. It would be hard to extract secrets from the powerful Breaks guy. Han Sen practiced on the shores of the lake for half a day. He was going to wait 12 hours before traveling to that mysterious world and visiting Horizontal Evil again. But before his time to go had arrived, he saw someone flying toward him. Uncle Yu, Han Sen said, raising an eyebrow when he saw the shape of the man. Yu Shanshin was riding a crane toward him. Yu Shanshin dismounted the crane. He stepped up to Han Sen with a smile and asked, "The thing that the leader wanted you to do, how has it been going so far?" "What do you mean?" "Sky Palace leader didn't ask me to do anything," Han Sen said, pretending to be surprised. Yu Shanshin nodded and said, "You are being very careful. That is how you should be, but you need to find that woman quickly." When he heard that, Han Sen believed Yu Shanshin really was aware of what Sky Palace leader had asked him to do. He raised a hand in surrender and said, "After coming to Outer Sky, I haven't had the chance to meet many of the very high. How am I supposed to locate my target?" Privately, Han Sen was thinking, and even if I had met many of the very high, I can't just strip them down to reveal whether or not they have a birthmark near their heart. This is a very tricky situation, but I believe you have what it takes, Yu Shanshin said with a smile. "What do you mean by that? And why can't you do it?" Han Sen frowned. "This is your task, not mine. I have other things to do. Yu Shanshin smiled and went on to say, right. If there is nothing more, in a few days, Exquisite and Li Qier will take you to the God area. You better behave yourself. The God area? I am just a half-deified. How will I go to the God area? Han Sun asked in consternation. He had heard of the God area before. It was a very special xenogenic space, rather like the core area. While only kings could go to the core area, the God area was a xenogenic space reserved for deifieds. Chapter 2705 Bao Lian. The very high have a way for you to enter the God area. But your reputation could hurt you there, Yu Shanshin said with a laugh. What does reputation have to do with going to the God area to hunt xenogenics? Han Sun didn't understand. Yu Shanshin's smile was grim. He told Han Sun, in the God area, they have more than just primitive xenogenics. They have all kinds of deified-level xenogenics. Even a super-strong half-deified will find themselves at the bottom of the God area food chain. Killing xenogenics in the God area will be exceptionally difficult, taking 10,000 steps backward. Even if you could kill them, you shouldn't have to go to the God area. Outer Sky already has many xenogenics. In fact, they probably have more than live in the God area. So the silkworms shouldn't have to go to the God area. Then why are they spending so much effort on taking us there? Han Sun asked, even more confused. Yu Shanshin laughed. Simple. They want us to fight other deified elites. When Han Sun heard that, he almost laughed in disbelief. No way. Other deifieds are harder to deal with than deified xenogenics. If I can't kill deified xenogenics, how am I supposed to deal with deified elites? Good question. Normally, we wouldn't have the power to fight the deifieds of another race. But with the very high, things are a little different, Yu Shanshin said with a smile. Now Han Sun understood. The very high had a particular purpose for pitting them against other deified warriors. It was training in a twisted way. Considering that the silkworms were valuable to the very high, the deifieds of other races would go easy on them. They wouldn't kill silkworms like Han Senator, and the silkworms could fight against fighters from other races, allowing them to increase their knowledge and power. They could gain more experience by doing this. They would basically be using deifieds from across the universe as sparring partners. Only the very high would dare to attempt such an audacious plan. What if we run into a grumpy deified? There might be some deifieds who don't respect the very high enough to avoid killing us. What would we do then? Han Sun asked with confusion. Although the very high were powerful, there was no chance that every single person respected them. If Han Sun ran into someone who disliked the very high for some reason, his little vacation to the God area could prove quite deadly. Yu Shanshin tilted his head at Han Sr. Have you forgotten what silkworms are? To the very high, we are considered tools. And if a tool breaks, it can be replaced. After pausing, Yu Shanshin said, plus, many of the deifieds know this about the very high. If they refused the very high's request, it would cause problems for them. Some of them are quite eager to teach us, the chosen of the very high, a good lesson. They might not want to kill us, but they would rather enjoy making us suffer. When you go there, you must be prepared. That means we are going to the God area to get our butts kicked. Han Sun had a wry smile. That is close enough to the truth, but fights like these will help to steel our will and improve our combat abilities. Many half-deified silkworms become deified in God area fights. I guess that can be considered the silver lining. Yu Shanshin shrugged, then waved casually to Han Sr. I'm leaving. You need to hurry up with the task that the leader gave you. 4 years is neither a long nor short amount of time. Either way, you should get it done as soon as possible. Of course, shortly after Yu Shanshin and Han Sun had this conversation, Li Qier and Exquisite showed up at Underworld Lake. There they told Han Sun he would need to go to the God area to practice. Han Sun had prepared himself, so he readily agreed. But because of this, Han Sun didn't have another chance to go and see horizontal evil. The God area was accessed in a similar way to the core area. A person had to generate substance chains, and then they could push open the God area door. Han Sun and most of the other silkworms hadn't yet generated substance chains, but the very high had a genofluid, that would allow them to generate substance chains for a short period of time. That way, they could enter the God area sooner than would be possible if they relied on their natural ascension process. The very high could also use a special connection to the silkworms to follow their silkworms to the God area. But because creating this genofluid was difficult, each silkworm was only granted 3 vials of the stuff. That meant that until Han's son became deified, he could only go to the God area 3 times. So each time he went to the God area, he would have to stay there as long as he could before exiting. After Han's son used his first vial of genofluid, his power didn't increase. Changes began to occur throughout his body though. He was able to generate a substance chain. It was more of an image in truth. While it had the structure of a substance chain, it lacked a deified level of power. Hansen's personal strength didn't increase after he drank the fluid. The process of opening the gate to the God area was the same as opening the core area door. The only difference was that Likir and Exquisite could also enter the God area door that Hansen opened. They stepped into the God area alongside Han Sr. The God area looks the same as the regular universe. Hansen found himself standing on a grass field. He looked around. He thought the God area and the universe looked similar. The biggest difference was the fact that the land around him seemed to stretch as far as he could see in every direction. There didn't seem to be an end. You have just come to the God area, so you aren't familiar with this place yet, Likir said. When you see a God spirit storm, you will realize how scary the God area can actually be. What is a God spirit storm? Hansen asked. The God area doesn't have any xenogenics usually. They only show up when a God spirit storm arrives. Xenogenics only appear in such storms. So that will show you the brutal reality of the God area. If there weren't any God spirit storms, you could treat this place like a holiday hotspot. Likir laughed. As they were talking, someone came flying through the sky toward them. Hansen had a look at who it was, and he noticed it was a deified extreme king. Are you the extreme king known as Baolian? Exquisite asked. Who are you? The deified extreme king looked at Exquisite with confusion. We are Exquisite and Likir of the Very High. Greetings. Exquisite and Likir greeted the man. Baolian heard the words Very High, and he seemed to remember something. He smiled and asked, You two are ladies of the Very High? Do you need anything? Baolian said that, but he looked at Hansen instead. He was obviously aware of what Likir and Exquisite wanted him to do. He recognized Hansen as well. It was difficult for people of the Extreme King not to recognize Han Senator. He had killed a prince, defeated an elder, and kidnapped King Bai's favorite son, after all. There were many in the universe who might not recognize Hansen at first glance, but most of the Extreme King did. Their hatred for him ran deep in their hearts. I heard that Hansen had become a silkworm of the Very High. I can't believe he has shown up in the God area so soon. And here I am meeting him. This is a great chance for me, Baolian thought to himself. His eyes flashed. Chapter 2706 Life and Death is a matter of fate. Baolian wasn't planning on killing Hansen in front of the Very High, but he wanted to use this opportunity to teach him a lesson. There was nothing the Very High could say against that. But Baolian was aware that Hansen had the shield of the Medusa's gaze. Even Meng Lai had been frozen by Hansen and left to dangle in the sky. The Extreme King had spent a great many resources resuscitating Meng Lai after that gross defeat. In addition, Baolian was just a primitive deified. He wouldn't dare try to take on the shield of the Medusa's gaze if it was used against him. We have brought Hansen to the God area for practice. I hope you can teach him a thing or two, sir, Likir said. If you are both asking this of me, then I would be remiss not to help out. But if we use weapons, someone might get hurt. I suggest we don't make use of treasures. What do you both think of that? Baolian said with a smile. What you say makes sense, Mr. Bao. Exquisite could see through what Baolian was thinking, but she still agreed with his suggestion. If they didn't agree, Baolian might refuse to fight against Han Senator, and if treasures were allowed, Hansen probably wouldn't gain as much battle experience. For Likir and Exquisite, that would defeat the point. As far as whether Baolian would try to kill Hansen, Exquisite wasn't worried about it. Bao Lian was just a primitive deified. Even though he wouldn't be using treasures, Han Sun still had God's wonder. That in itself was very good. It wouldn't be difficult for him to escape danger if the need for flight arose. With the two of them near, as well, it was unlikely Han Sun would be killed. Han Sun had no opinion on the matter. He was more interested in finding out the difference between his current strength and that of a primitive deified. Bao Lian, seeing Exquisite agree, smiled and said, "In that case, I can help you." Han Sun knew what Bao Lian was thinking as well, but he didn't address the matter. He walked up to Bao Lian and looked the man over. "What is your connection to Bao Qin?" When Han Sun said the name Bao Qin, and it made Bao Lian's face run cold, he said in an icy voice, "Bao Qin is a family member." "Ah, you guys are family? That is good. I never did get to wrap up matters with him the last time we met. If you are from the same family, allow me to exact my vengeance through you." "Sins of the family and all," Han Sun said. "Of course I feel the same. But what do you mean by vengeance?" Bao Lian asked, laughing darkly. "To exact my vengeance, I think it is only right that we fight for our lives. You don't have to worry about the rules. Use everything you have at your disposal. Life and death is a matter of fate after all," Han Sun said. "Huh? You're going to use the shield of the Medusa's gaze to fight me?" Bao Lian looked at Han Sun and spoke in a hard voice. He didn't think Han Sun would be nice enough to let him kill him if things ended up that way. Han Sun didn't speak. He took off his Apollo set and handed the garb over to Li Qier. He then passed the shield of the Medusa's gaze to her. "Just like before, I will not use treasures. You, however, can use whatever you like," Han Sun said to Bao Lian after he finished divesting himself of treasures. Bao Lian looked at Han Sun with confusion. He had no idea what Han Sun was thinking. But whatever it was, it looked like the man was committing suicide. But Han Sun didn't look like someone who wanted to die. He must have had a trick up his sleeve, Bao Lian figured. What? An extreme king deified is scared of a barehanded half-deified? Han Sun looked at Bao Lian with a wolfish smile. "I'm just afraid these two ladies might disagree." Bao Lian grunted as he looked at Exquisite and Li Qier. "If this is his decision, then we cannot interfere," Exquisite said. She and Li Qier could read Han Sun's mind, so they didn't need him to explain his intentions. "In that case, please don't take what is about to happen as a show of disrespect to the very high." Bao Lian's eyes shone with a godly light. He peered at Han Sun as substance chains unfolded around him like petals. They wrapped him up. Han Sun didn't move, but he pushed the power of the story of genes as far as it would go. He looked at Bao Lian and said, "Do it. If you let me strike first, I'm afraid you will be unable to fight back. If you want to die, then I'm happy to fulfill your wish." Bao Lian was filled with fury when he heard Han Sun's boasting. He looked murderous, but he didn't lose his cool. He opened his fingers wide and looked at Han Senator. A giant lotus flower substance chain appeared next to Han Senator. The petals fluttered open, as if they were ready to snatch and throttle Han Senator. Han Sun teleported away. Like the wind, he slipped out of the attack. Bao Lian's power looked like blooming flowers. Wherever his attacks went, lotuses would appear. It made Han Sun appear to be dancing across a sea of flowers. Han Sun was calm. He traveled around the sea of flowers, not being harmed by Bao Lian's substance chains. Han Sun's battle power has improved. "The deified Bao Lian isn't even making him break a sweat," muttered Li Qier. She was shocked whenever she read Han Sun's mind and saw how cool he was. Exquisite nodded and said, "It looks like the fight against the red blood demon helped him grow a lot. It is a shame we were unable to see the details of that fight. If we could, it would have helped us a lot." "It is fine. In the God area, we are bound to meet many more elites. There will be plenty more chances for us to learn," Li Qier said. "This isn't the same. Fighting against the red blood demon was a real deathmatch. In this God area, the other elites are going to go easy on Han Sun because of you and I. Han Sun won't get much out of it. His life isn't really on the line." Exquisite paused for a bit, and then she went on to say, "This fight will probably help Han Sun a good amount though. If you and I pay close attention, we are bound to get something out of it." Li Qier nodded, and then they both stopped talking. They were trying to focus on Han Sun's feelings and learn how his mind worked during a fight like this. Bao Lian's heart was pounding. He realized that he had no clue how to stop Han Sen. His speed and power were greater than Han Sen's. But his opponent still seemed to know everywhere he was going to attack. Han Sen could always dash to safety and render his attacks void. Han Sen was more than disappointed with his enemy. He was up against a primitive deified, but Bao Lian was far weaker than the red blood demon. Their power levels might be similar, but the Bao Lian's will and combat experience were far inferior. The red blood demon really did possess a true god mind. He was nothing like an average primitive deified. Han Sen realized he was now fighting a proper primitive deified. Although he wasn't stronger, it wouldn't be easy for a primitive deified to keep Han Sen under their thumb. If all 4 of his Geno arts were elevated to half deified, he could probably take down a primitive deified with relative ease. Bao Lian couldn't suppress Han Sen. His face had reddened with rage and embarrassment. He was a deified of the extreme king, and yet he couldn't suppress Han Sen, who wasn't even using any treasures. It would be embarrassing if people learned about this. Bao Lian saw Exquisite and Li Qier staring at the fight with expressionless faces. He thought to himself, if Han Sen has a death wish, then I will kill him even though he is with the very high. With that thought, Bao Lian stopped hesitating. His forehead shone with a god light. A white lotus flower appeared on his brow, and it began to spin around and around. Finally, it's here. I wonder what Bao Lian's king body can accomplish. Han Sen had expected this to happen, and so he watched Bao Lian closely. Chapter 2707 God Spirit Storm. When the lotuses opened up, Bao Lian was like a Buddha sitting in the air. The lotus became a shadow that enclosed his body within it. He was like some spiritual being born from a lotus flower. Han Sen could feel a weird sort of presence being released from Bao Lian's body. Even Han Sen had to compliment him, saying, "The Extreme King's king bodies are so scary." Just using his king body has allowed him to increase his presence by many multiples. The deifieds of an ordinary race cannot fight against the deifieds of the Extreme King. While Han Sen was still lost in thought, Bao Lian closed his eyes and said, "I didn't want to kill you, but you seem to be seeking your death. Don't blame me for doing what you have asked me to do. If you have power, show me what you've got. Otherwise, stop talking crap," Han Sen said. Bao Lian didn't speak. He opened his eyes and suddenly looked at Han Sen. Han Sen felt like Bao Lian's vision was now on him. He suddenly felt a foreign energy wind around him. But what this new power was, Han Sen couldn't determine. It was like it was there, but it was not there. After that look, Bao Lian turned his head away and started running off. "We haven't determined a winner yet. Where are you going?" Han Sen said with a frown. "You're dead. Go and prepare your funeral," Bao Lian said over his shoulder as he continued heading away. His sprinting form soon disappeared from sight. Han Sen wanted to go after Bao Lian, but that strange, almost undetectable power was making him feel sick. Since Exquisite and Li Qier were near, Han Sen didn't want to use his other Geno arts to get rid of the effect. He looked at them and said, "Did you both see what kind of power Bao Lian used on me?" Li Qier shook her head. Bao Lian is an heir of the former ruler King Bao. Bao Lian is one of his children. Right now King Bai is in charge. King Bao wasn't very powerful, therefore he isn't that famous. "Can you tell what element was used against me?" Han Sen asked. Exquisite examined Han Sen's body. After a while she said, "The very high are very skilled when it comes to sensing types of energy. But Bao Lian's power is very strange. Not even I can tell what element he used. It felt like causal power, but that isn't exactly right." With Exquisite and Li Qier both being unable to determine what they had just witnessed, Han Sen frowned. He used the story of genes to examine his body, but he didn't find anything weird within him. His power seemed to be unaffected. There were no hidden wounds or anything. He had no clue what Bao Lian's power had done to him. Is Bao Lian playing a prank on me? Han Sen double-checked his body to ensure things were all right. Exquisite and Li Qier examined Han Sen using many different methods, but they failed to learn anything. Han Sen could detect some sort of power surrounding him, but it couldn't be removed. In his heart, though, he felt as if something was deeply wrong. While Han Sun was trying his best to avoid using his Dongxian area, he suddenly heard a scary sound coming from the sky. The three of them immediately raised their heads to see what was coming. The sunny skies were becoming cloudy and overcast. All of a sudden, everything around them became pitch black. Within the blink of an eye, the sky looked dark. A god spirit storm is here. We have to go. Exquisite and Li Qier looked to be in shock. They pulled Han Sun away with them by making use of galaxy teleport. They wanted to stay as far away from the god spirit storm as they possibly could. Exquisite and Li Qier were already half deified. They only dared to venture across these lands due to the fact that they had the power of God's Wander. They could use it to avoid the areas that were claimed by god spirit storms. Otherwise, with their current power, it would only take a couple of deified xenogeneics to bury them. After using galaxy teleport, Han Sun found himself in a desert. There was no way to tell how far he might have teleported away, but the sky no longer had a god spirit storm brewing in it. Before the three of them had enough time to come to their senses, they heard the sky growl with a scary peal of thunder again. The ominous cloud covered the sky again. Why are we so unlucky? We've run into a god spirit storm again, Exquisite said with a frown. We don't have time to worry about that right now. Let's just run, Li Qier said quickly. If they ended up getting dragged into a god spirit storm, there was an 80% to 90% chance they would end up slaughtered. The three of them used galaxy teleport again. They went to someplace else. But as soon as they appeared in their new location, the sky showed signs of a brewing god spirit storm once more. This time, even Han Sun could feel that something was wrong. His eyes narrowed and he said, "It cannot be Bao Lian's power doing this to me, can it? That is impossible. Bao Lian is just a primitive deified. His power is far too weak for him to affect, much less control, a god spirit storm. He's the lowest rank of deified, and even a true god couldn't summon a god spirit storm," Li Qier said. The three of them used galaxy teleport again. But after a few more jumps, they realized that a god spirit storm would begin to brew wherever they went. I must be right. It must be Bao Lian's power affecting the god spirit storm and causing it to spawn around us. Although this possibility was hard to put stock in, there didn't seem to be any other explanation. Before they met Bao Lian, no god spirit storms had plagued them. But now god spirit storms were appearing wherever they went. It was obviously connected with Bao Lian's power. Li Qier and Exquisite found this to be incredibly difficult to believe. After all, Bao Lian was just a primitive deified. The notion that he could control a god spirit storm was outlandish. But then again, this was the fact that was staring them in the face. They had no choice but to accept the reality in front of them. The god spirit storm comes too quickly. We don't have enough time to open the door to leave the god area. And if we keep using galaxy teleport, we won't last long that way, either, Li Qier said. Her face was rapidly losing its color. Galaxy teleport was a bit of an energy hog. The further they teleported, the more energy it cost them. But teleporting only a short distance wouldn't take them far enough from the god spirit storm to keep them safe. Han Sun was studying God's Wander, but he hadn't learned galaxy teleport yet. He had to be carried by Exquisite or Li Qier, and that was costing them even more energy. If they kept using galaxy teleport like that, the two of them would only have the energy to make another 20 to 30 jumps. With the power they were spending, the distance they could travel would continue to decrease. Qier, you teleport to another location. Exquisite will teleport somewhere else with me. Then we'll meet up on our next jump, Han Sun said to Li Qier. The two of them could sense what Han Sun was thinking. They didn't object, and they did as he instructed. With this test, they were able to confirm that the problem was indeed Han's senator. After Li Qier teleported away by herself, she didn't encounter a god spirit storm again. And when Exquisite and Han Sun teleported, they were immediately hounded by the god spirit storm again. It looks like I underestimated that deified elite. Han Sun had to admit his failure this time. He had lost completely. Bao Lian, who was just a primitive deified, had placed him quite firmly in a terrible situation. This was a very dangerous situation for him to be in. Exquisite and Li Qier had followed him there. But if the two women opened their doors, Han Sun wouldn't be able to leave. He had to open the God area gate himself. However, judging by the time it took to open the door, and how long it took for a God spirit storm to spawn, he would be sucked into the storm before he could slip out of the God area. Right now he was at the end of the road. Unless the God spirit storm stopped chasing him, that was. Otherwise he would end up in the storm. Thinking about the countless deified xenogeneics that spawned inside those storms, Han Sen's head felt itchy. Chapter 27:08 No choice. Exquisite took Han Sun with her, as she teleported a few more times. But she was unable to shake off the pursuit of the God spirit storm. No matter where they teleported to, a God spirit storm would be on them in an instant. The God spirit storm was a very persistent stalker. Leave me here and go on. Han Sun could see that Exquisite's face was drenched in sweat, and the energy flows in her body weren't circulating correctly. He knew she had used Galaxy Teleport too many times. Her body had a limit, and she was almost tapped out. But Exquisite ignored what Han Sun told her. She thought for a minute then said, I have found a way. We will teleport to Bao Lian. Bao Lian won't let himself be trapped in the same God spirit storm he placed on you. So, if we followed where he went, we might be able to find a way to erase the power he put on you. That is useless. We won't be able to find him now. Han Sun shook his head with a tired smile. Exquisite teleported away again, and her eyes slowly changed color. Her eyes darted here and there, but she couldn't latch onto an image of Bao Lian. Stop searching. He must have left the God area. He wouldn't allow himself to go down with us, Han Sun said. He had already figured as much, and this simply confirmed his suspicions. There must be a way. Exquisite's face looked different from how it usually did, and that was because she was out of options. She could not control a place like the God area. Seriously, you should go. The God spirit storm is coming after me, and I'm the one that challenged Bao Lian to a deathmatch. This is my responsibility, Han Sun said. Exquisite shook her head. You are my silkworm. I'm not going to let you die. I thought that to the very high, silkworms are just instruments to you. If I was to die, you would just find another one, Han Sun said, meeting Exquisite's eyes. Exquisite shivered. It was just as Han Sun said. Silkworms were little more than tools used in the progression and ascension of the very high. And Han Sun wasn't the only person who thought that. The very high who studied the very high sense thought that silkworms were nothing more than toys of the universe. They looked at most people and creatures of different races like that. Right now Exquisite was caught in an inner conflict. According to what she had been taught by her people, her course of action was clear. She should simply leave and select another silkworm. But for some reason, Exquisite didn't want to do this. She knew it wasn't helping, but she kept teleporting Han Sun away again and again. She didn't go to Li Qir either. Doing so would have been pointless. It would just force Li Qir to flee with them, and things would continue to go downhill. He is such a powerful silkworm. I will never find another one like one. If I'm to succeed in this life, I need someone like him. I must do what I can to save him. Exquisite said all this to herself. Every time she teleported, she looked for a way in which she might be able to help Han Senator, but no matter what she tried, there didn't seem to be a way out of this predicament. There was nothing she could do to escape. Although the very high were considered incredibly powerful, only a deified could sort this out. Exquisite was far too weak right now. Exquisite's aura became more and more disrupted, and her eyes were deeply bloodshot. Her face was colored a deep scarlet. Han Sun knew she had reached the end of her rope. She looked exhausted. Han Sun felt so touched by her dedication, but he was also in a hurry. For reasons that he didn't dare think about while she was nearby, he needed Exquisite to leave him alone for a moment. But Exquisite was too stubborn to leave him by himself. Her life force was messed up, but she still used Galaxy Teleport to haul Han Sun around. After using Galaxy Teleport again, Exquisite fell into a coughing fit. Blood speckled her lips. She had used too much energy. I'm really grateful for your determination, but you should leave. I will find a way to survive, Han Sun murmured, supporting Exquisite's shaking body as she coughed. Exquisite wiped the blood from her mouth. She looked at the sky and saw the black clouds and the thunder. Her face was expressionless as she said, "If I cannot even save my silkworm's life, how can I unlock the full potential of sky and man combined together?" When he heard her say that, Han Sun felt even more worried. Despite their dire situation, Exquisite was still refusing to leave. As the God Spirit storm formed again, Exquisite grabbed Han Sun and used God's Wander to teleport away. But this time, when they reappeared, Han Sun realized they weren't far enough from the God Spirit storm to reset the cycle. Exquisite had simply used up too much of her power, and she didn't have enough juice left in her. Jumps like this wouldn't take them far enough. Exquisite noticed they were still under the same God Spirit storm, and her face went gray. She tried to use more power to teleport again, but as soon as she moved, she coughed up even more blood. Her body was too exhausted to use Galaxy Teleport any longer. As Exquisite's body shivered and shook, Han Sun felt sick. If Exquisite had left, he could have easily sorted out this situation. But Exquisite's strong will was causing him more and more trouble. Even so, Exquisite's determination touched Han Sun deeply. After all, the whole reason Exquisite had stayed by his side was because of her desire to save him. How many people exist who would truly sacrifice themselves on behalf of another? The very high are a very complicated race, but why do people claim they are heartless? Han Sun thought to himself. Exquisite sensed what Han Sun was thinking, and an unreadable expression passed over her face. She looked at the sky and the God Spirit storm coming, but she couldn't move away. Exquisite suddenly turned to him. "Han Sun, I'm afraid we won't be leaving here alive today." "We aren't going to die," Han Sun said quietly. He used the small jade figure to stop the sync of his 7 senses. Exquisite could no longer feel his mind and emotions. Exquisite kept talking as if she hadn't heard what Han Sun had said. "I used to think that my little sister's choices were ridiculous. I thought that the very high sense was the pride of the very high, the legacy of our race. Little sister wasn't proud of our legacy. She always found ways to get around practicing the very high sense too. She even got lazy, and I could never understand why." Before Han Sun could respond, Exquisite carried on by saying, "But now I seem to understand. Having a heart that connects to the entire universe feels rather empty. The very high forget about love. This teaching has been with our race for as long as we can remember. But despite all that, each one of us is just another creature of the universe. We aren't machines. Sometimes having a little heart can be quite attractive." "You don't have to practice the very high sense," Han Sun said. Exquisite shook her head. "I have no choice. Your fate within the very high is determined for you when you are born. Li Qir didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. I thought Li Yuzhen was sad, considering that he would never have the chance to practice the very high sense. But now I envy him and the others. If I had the choice, I would prefer to be like them. I don't want to practice the very high sense. I want to be like a normal member of the very high. But that doesn't matter anymore," Exquisite said coldly, watching the God Spirit storm sweep toward them. She sounded very calm. She almost sounded relieved. Either way, she didn't fear death. Chapter 2709 Deified Xenogeneics in the storm. Han Sun looked at the sky. Then, he looked at Exquisite. He suddenly raised a hand and slapped Exquisite across the back of the head, knocking her out. If Exquisite was in peak condition, knocking her out wouldn't have been so easy. But right now she was completely exhausted. Her entire body was running on fumes, and she would never have expected Han Sun to attack her. So, she was instantly knocked unconscious. "I'm sorry. I must do something that will affect a whole race, so I cannot let anyone else know about it." Han Sun picked up Exquisite's unconscious form. He looked up to the darkening sky above him, and as he did so, his eyes started to turn white. Then his whole body began to glow as he activated his Super God Spirit mode. Although the transformation had only just begun, the weird power that had been clinging to Han Sun was vanquished the moment his Super God body activated. It was completely gone. In a matter of moments, the glowing white power disappeared as well. Han Sun's body returned to normal again. Finally, it is gone. The foreign energy that had plagued him had vanished, and he felt much relief. Bao Lian's attack had been expunged. The scary God Spirit storm wasn't gone though. It was still there in the sky. Boom, boom, boom. Lightning flashed across the pitch-black sky, sending bursts of light across the clouds. When the lightning struck, the whole sky rumbled with thunder. The lightning and thunder began to build in frequency and intensity. It made the whole sky and earth become an ocean of electricity. Han Sen looked glum. He didn't know if the God Spirit storm was a remnant of Bao Lian's power, or if it simply wouldn't recede, because it had already formed. Regardless, he was now stuck inside that God Spirit storm. Any hope of an easy escape was gone. That thunderstorm was so weird. Although the storm pulsed with lightning, the lightning bolts never damaged the grass when they touched down. It was like the lightning was fake. But Han Sen knew the lightning was very real. But the element that composed it was rather special. And now that he was inside this thunderstorm, he couldn't use his teleportation techniques. The surrounding area seemed to be locked down by the storm. Exquisite had depleted her energy reserves before Han Sen knocked her out. And even if she had been awake and full of power, she wouldn't have been able to teleport them away either. I have no idea if we can escape this God Spirit storm alive. Han Sen didn't hesitate. Still holding Exquisite, he flew through the thunderstorm at full speed. Lightning fell across his body like raindrops. Although it didn't hurt or numb him, he could definitely feel it. Boom! Boom! Somewhere within the thunderstorm off to Han Sen's side, a giant bolt of lightning exploded. But within the light of that bolt, he saw a shadow standing on the ground. The burst of light was so bright that Han Sen could only make out the shape of the shadow. It was a monster with the head and horns of a bull. A pair of bat wings spread from its back. That was all Han Sen could see in the momentary flash of light. He didn't dare to think about it too much. Instead, he continued to fly forward at full speed. While he was flying, another burst of bright light exploded in front of him. Han Sen saw the bull monster appear in front of him, and it was approaching. Thunder rolled with every step it took, and the creature moved with a mountainous sense of gravity. Its body was 100 meters tall, and every step caused the realm to quake. The hair on Han Sen's arms stood on end. He knew he had been targeted by the scary Xenogeniac, and while they hadn't made contact yet, Han Sen could feel that its presence was not a meager primitive class. Sacrifice, are you calling me? The mountainous bull monster stood amidst the storm. It was like a thunderbolt itself. Its eyes were massive, and they looked straight at Han Sr. Its voice rumbled, but Han Sen could hear it clearly within the thunderstorm. Although it was looking at Han Sen, the monster was confused. It wasn't sure if Han Sen was its sacrifice. Han Sen's heart jumped and he thought, Bao Lian, that asshole. His power put some sort of sacrificial marker on me that this deified can detect? No wonder the God Spirit storm kept chasing me. He made me an offering for a deified Xenogeniac. I think you've made a mistake. I'm not your sacrifice. You should go and look elsewhere for it. Han Sen wasn't sure if the monster would understand him, but the creature did appear rather intelligent. If the creature could be reasoned with, then perhaps he could talk his way out of this. The bull monster heard what Han Sen said, but it didn't leave. It just looked at him and Exquisite. You might not be my sacrifice, but you are already here. I cannot return empty-handed. I must take one of you with me as my sacrifice. The bull monster's voice echoed in the thunder. Han Sen understood what the bull monster meant. Either he or Exquisite would have to go with the creature. He looked at the comatose Exquisite. There was no one to stop him from handing her over. But when he thought about Exquisite's desperation and willingness to die in order to save him, he knew that giving her to the bull monster wasn't an option. But Han Sen didn't want to sacrifice himself either. We are both weak, low-level creatures. We cannot be your sacrifice. Why don't I take you somewhere else to find you a better sacrifice? The bull monster didn't speak. It stood silently as peals of thunder continued to roll across the sky. Although it didn't speak, Han Sen understood what it meant. It had already made its mind up to take one of them as a sacrifice. Does your sacrifice have to be a creature? Could it be something else? Han Sen asked. I wouldn't mind the shield that you're carrying on your back, said the bull monster's rumbling voice. Han Sen was shocked. He knew immediately which shield the bull monster was talking about. It was referring to the shield of the Medusa's gaze. This guy is smart, but he's just a Xenogeniac. He isn't one of the Ghana. Why does he want the shield of the Medusa's gaze? I'm afraid that only the Ghana can make full use of it. Han Sen was confused, and so he asked the bull monster, "What do you want this shield for? This is a treasure belonging to the Ghana. It can't be activated by someone who lacks the blood of the Ghana." But now that Han Sen had a moment to think about it, he understood why the bull monster had been willing to stand around talking to them, instead of just killing them on sight. This guy is scared of the shield of the Medusa's gaze. That's why he's being cautious, instead of just attacking me. That realization was a great relief for Han Senator. If the bull monster had a reason to fear Han Sen, then he and Exquisite had a much better chance of escaping. And Han Sen had no intention of handing over the shield of the Medusa's gaze. His opponent was just a xenogeniac, so who could tell if it would even keep its promise? At the moment, its fear of the shield of the Medusa's gaze was keeping it at bay. If Han Sen gave it the shield, however, that would be the same as forfeiting his life. Han Sen would never allow another to control his fate. He doesn't know that I cannot use the shield of the Medusa's gaze. This is a chance for me, Han Sen thought to himself. Chapter 27:10 Honest Cow-Headed Monster. Hand over my sacrifice or forfeit your lives. The bull monster glared at Han Sr. You see, we are not your sacrifice, and yet you are asking us to give you something valuable. That is simply not appropriate. Han Sen could see that the bull monster's intelligence wasn't very high, and he could tell that the creature was afraid of the shield of the Medusa's gaze. So he stopped playing nice. When it heard what Han Sen said, the bull monster started to get angry. Before it could react, though, Han Sen continued. How about this? We'll make a wager. If you win, I will give you the shield as a sacrifice. What do you want to wager? The bull monster asked. Han Sen was pleasantly surprised that the creature was considering his proposal. He hadn't actually expected the bull monster to agree to his suggestion. He only wanted to stall for more time and extract some extra information from the bull monster. But it seemed as if the bull monster was genuinely interested. This deified creature is easier to talk to than I thought. Han Sen didn't dare to let his guard down. He thought about it and then asked the bull monster, "So what should I call you?" "Whatever you like," the bull monster said impassively. "I will call you Brother Bull. Have you ever played coin toss, Brother Bull?" Han Sen asked him. "What is a coin toss?" the bull monster asked with curiosity. Opportunities just kept presenting themselves. So Han Sen quickly brought out a coin and explained. This coin has two sides. One side features a number, and the other side contains the image of a person's head. I will shake the coin in my hands, and you have to guess which will be shown when I reveal the coin, the number or the head. If you guess it correctly, I will give you the shield as a sacrifice. How does that sound? Sure. Let's start then, the bull monster said. Its voice had grown much quieter than it had been at the beginning. Han Sen laughed and said, Brother Bull, if this is a bet, we both need to put something on the table for the wager. I am offering up this shield, but if you lose, what are you going to give me? Han Sen was testing how far he could push this bull monster. There was nothing he really wanted from the creature, and if it grew angry, Han Sen would ask for nothing more. Surprisingly, the bull monster really did bring out something. Pang! The bull monster dropped the item right in front of Han Senator. It fell, creating a deep hole when it hit the ground. Han Sen craned his neck to get a look at it. It was a gemstone with thunder trapped inside it. It was only the size of an egg, but the lightning inside it was shining with power. It looked as if it might randomly explode at any given moment. There was a frightening amount of energy inside the small item. Let's use this lightning Geno core to sweeten the pot, boomed the bull monster's voice. Is this a deified Geno core? Han Sen was shocked. He hadn't expected the bull monster to offer up something so expensive. A deified Geno core was a treasure only deified xenogeniacs could create. They were called treasures, but they were different from the ones that were artificially constructed. Deified Geno cores could melt into a person's body and give the Geno core power directly to their recipient. Ordinary synthetic treasures required the user's power to activate. Once a deified Geno core was absorbed into a person's body, however, they could use it with the same ease as one of their own Geno arts. Deified genocores were also known as skill genocores. They were very useful, but only deified xenogeneics could create them. Even for deified xenogeneics, producing one was no mean feat. A single deified genocore was considered quite precious. Even if people killed a deified xenogeneic, ordinary deified xenogeneics would destroy their genocores before death. They would never allow one to fall into enemy hands. Brother Bull is truly generous, Han Sen thought as tears leaked down his face. Now that the bull monster had wagered something so valuable, Han Sen had to gather his wits before he could respond. Deified genocores were divided into ranks, and the bull monster was definitely above primitive class. If he was able to get the creature's deified genocore and absorb it, Han Sen would receive a power that was equivalent to the bull monster's. And since it was a geno art, that was a very good thing. What? Is that not enough for the wager? The bull monster saw Han Sen staring at the deified genocore in profound silence. He thought Han Sen wanted something more. Although the bull monster wasn't particularly intelligent, it was smarter than a lot of other xenogeneics. But compared to intelligent creatures like humans or very high, the bull only had the mind of a 7 or 8-year-old. He recognized that the shield of the Medusa's gaze was a powerful item, and he knew his genocore was nowhere near as valuable as the shield. That was why he had asked if he needed to wager something else as well. It is a little bit unfair if you ask me, but because it is you, Brother Bull, I will accept it, Han Sen conceded, looking a little embarrassed. He hadn't anticipated that the scary bull monster would be so easy to fool. It made him wonder if he was dreaming. He had never known that the world had a xenogeneic that was this easy to talk to. Then let us begin, the bull monster said as he stared eagerly at the coin Han Sen was holding. The bull monster had once seemed scary and almighty, but by this point, that image had been completely scrubbed out of Han Sen's mind. Han Sen lifted the coin and smiled at the bull monster. He said, "Brother Bull, look closely. This side is the number, and this side has the image." After that, Han Sen clasped his hands together and began shaking them back and forth. And while Han Sen was shaking his hands, he used his Dongxian area power to keep the bull monster from stealing any information about the coin. The Dongxian area wasn't as powerful as the bull monster, but it would allow Han Sen to see all the cogwheels spinning nearby. Han Sen might not be able to stop the universal cogwheels if they act strangely, but he would definitely notice. Han Sen had underestimated the bull monster's honesty though. The beast really wasn't trying to steal a look at the coin. Eventually, Han Sen stopped shaking his hands and held them up before the bull monster. The creature looked at Han Sen's hands and hesitated to make a decision. He was guessing which would end up on top, the image or the number. Did this bull monster grow up with a family? Why is he so honest? Han Sen would never have guessed that a xenogeneic like this existed. Number, the bull monster said eventually, after a long time of hesitation. Brother Bull, are you sure that the coin is showing a number? Once you confirm your bet, you cannot change your mind again, Han Sen said, smiling at the bull monster. I will choose the image then, the bull monster said. It actually changed its mind. Are you sure it's the image? Are you certain of your answer now? Han Sen smiled again. Yes, it is the image. I'm not changing, the bull monster said, gritting its teeth. Han Sen opened his hands to reveal that it was the number that was facing up. Han Sen looked at the bull monster and said, Brother Bull, what a shame. You should have stood by your gut instinct earlier. Although Han Sen appeared calm, his body was tense and ready to attack. If the bull monster was going to lash out after losing, Han Sen would have to react instantly. He was afraid the bull monster would disregard the results of their wager. But the bull monster simply stared at the coin for a while. Do it again, he said after a while. If the bull monster hadn't had such a scary presence, Han Sen would never have believed that it was a high-level deified xenogeneic. Chapter 27:11 You're good, do it again, the bull monster said in a ragged voice. Giant wings spread from the bull monster's back, and its body was covered in blue scales. But the creature stared at Han Sen with childlike intensity. Han Sen had heard him repeat those 3 words several times while they gambled. Han Sen had won 7 times. By now, the bull monster's eyes looked as if they were going to burst into flames. Han's son was worried that the beast might attack him out of frustration. How about you shake the coin, and I will guess? Han's son suggested, setting the coin down in front of the monster. When the bull monster heard him say this, his bull eyes brightened. He reached out a massive hand, using a power to pull the coin up into his coarse palms. You will do the guessing. We are still betting for that shield on your back, and the deified Geno cores that I lost. You will have to give them back, the bull monster said to Han's son while holding that coin. Sure. I'm willing to bet it all. Han's son blinked and went on to ask, Brother Bull, what are you going to bet? The bull monster hesitated. It only had 7 Geno cores, and they had all been lost to Han Senator. It had nothing more to gamble with. There were many elite and powerful xenogeneics scattered throughout the universe, but few of them would think of hiding something on purpose. They tended to be amazingly honest. The bull monster wasn't really giving up as much as it might have seemed. It had 7 Geno cores, but it had only created one of them by itself. The other 6 had been stolen from other xenogeneics it had killed. Stolen probably wasn't the right word though. The bull monster had eaten the bodies of the xenogeneics, and when he ran across their Geno cores, he thought they might prove useful. Therefore he took them, and now on this day, he had used them for gambling. Hansen noticed that the bull monster wasn't speaking. He suspected that it had nothing left to use as a wager. He was worried that the bull monster might get upset if it really had nothing left to offer. He quickly said, How about this, Brother Bull? You're smart and powerful enough to beat all the deifieds you come across. You could probably gather 10 shields and 100 Geno cores without much difficulty. If you wanted to, how about you do a favor for me as a bet? What favor would that be? The bull monster was honest, but he wasn't stupid. He looked slightly warily at Han Sr. Actually, the favor wouldn't really be helping me. I feel bad for you, Brother Bull. It was that goddamn asshole that summoned you. He didn't bring you a sacrifice. He was just playing you. If I see him again, I will try to punish him on your behalf. But I'm so weak. I'm not sure if I can fight him. It would be very embarrassing if I had to ask you to fight him on my behalf, Hansen confessed, looking at the bull with embarrassment. When the bull monster heard this, he thought Hansen was a very nice person. He actually wanted to help him. He looked at Hansen and nodded. You're good. Then it is settled. If I lose, you can have the shield and your Geno cores back. And if you lose when I find that guy again, I will ask you to help me out with him. And you will help me then and there, Hansen explained, carefully confirming their arrangement. Sure, the bull monster said with a nod. Then he proceeded to shake the coin. Hansen watched the way the bull monster shook the coin. He knew that the creature wasn't very good at gambling. After shaking it for a while, the bull monster held his hand out in front of Han's Senator with an awkward look. He said, You can guess. Brother Bull, do you know if it is the image or the number? Hansen asked with a smile. About that, the bull monster tried to think. He opened his hand and glanced at the coin. Then with a confident look he said, Of course I know what it is. Hurry up and guess. I guess. Hansen drew his voice out deliberately. He watched the bull monster's face. The bull monster looked very nervous, and then he went on to say, It is the image. When Hansen said that, the bull monster's face collapsed. Do it again. The bull monster gnashed its teeth and started shaking the coin. Do it again. Do it again. Do it again. An angry roar echoed through the sky, scarier than the thunder. Hansen couldn't even remember how many times he had won by this point. The bull monster probably owed him hundreds of favors by now. But Hansen had to acknowledge that the bull monster was honest. Although it had lost time and time again, it had never tried to kill Hansen in its rage. Suddenly, the storm above them lessened and grew visibly weaker. The rage left the bull monster's face and it shouted, Oh no! The God Spirit storm is going to end. That means I have to go back. Why do you have to go back when the storm recedes? Hansen asked with confusion. Most people knew that the xenogeneics in the God area followed the storms. They came when the storms came, and they vanished when the storms did. But no one seemed to know why creatures could only come and go with the storm. The bull monster didn't answer Han's Senator. It hesitated for a bit. Then it pulled a purple scale and tossed it to Han Sr. Use this scale if you ever need help. Putting your power into it will trigger it. I will follow the signal to come and find you. After that, the bull monster looked at Han Sen's new heap of Geno cores. Then, it turned around and prepared to leave with the fading storm. Brother Bull, hang on a sec. Han Sen stopped the bull monster. What now? The bull monster said, staring balefully at him. Han Sen grabbed one of the Geno cores out of the 7 he had received. He threw it to the bull monster and said, "It is fate that you and I were able to meet today. I don't have anything good to offer you, so you should keep this." The bull monster received the Geno core with genuine glee. That Geno core was the one the creature had created itself, and it was also the one that the bull monster had been looking at wistfully as it turned to leave. The other Geno cores were of various elements, so they wouldn't help the bull monster much. But the Geno core that the bull monster had created was very precious to him. "You really are so very kind." The bull monster was very touched by this gesture. He had wanted to steal Han Sen's things, but instead of holding a grudge, Han Sen was actually trying to help him. The entire situation made the bull monster quite emotional. He almost forgot that the Geno core had originally belonged to him anyway. "Brother Bull, you should leave now. When I find that guy, I will summon you so that you may teach him a lesson. I will avenge you." Han Sen waved his hand and said his goodbyes. The bull monster was becoming even more emotional, but the thunder was almost gone. He had no more time to speak. He thought Han Sen was a very good person. If there was a chance, he would definitely help Han Sen in the future. When the bull monster disappeared with the thunderstorm, Han Sen let out a long sigh. That was so close. I'm fortunate that he was an honest deified xenogeniac. If he wasn't, things might have turned out far worse for me. I need to stop being so reckless. Deifieds are deifieds. I cannot underestimate a single one of them. Han Sen made up his mind. If he saw Bao Lian again, he was going to end their feud permanently. After looking down and seeing that Exquisite was still in a coma, Han Sen sent a small jolt of power into her body. It seemed to unlock something inside of her, and Exquisite woke up. When Exquisite woke up, she jumped up. She stared at Han Sen with wide eyes and asked, "Why did you hit me? When did I hit you? You were so exhausted that you fainted." Han Sen said with a guilty look. "You." Exquisite started to reply, but then she realized something was amiss. She looked at the sky overhead and froze. Where is the God Spirit Storm? Chapter 27:12 Ice Geno Corback in the lands of the very high. Likir and Exquisite were sitting next to each other. Both of them looked bewildered and uncertain. "Third sister, you're telling me that when you woke up again, the God Spirit Storm was gone?" Likir asked, looking at Exquisite with sheer disbelief. Exquisite's expression was strange. "That is what Han Sen told me." "Weird. With your will, third sister, you shouldn't have fallen into a coma, even if your body collapsed. That simply shouldn't be possible. How did you slip into a coma from mere exhaustion? And how did the God Spirit Storm suddenly disappear? This is so weird." Likir looked as if she couldn't believe it. After pausing, she said, "We're fortunate that these unlikely events did occur, however. If they hadn't, you and Han Sen would have been in real danger." Likir wasn't suspicious of Han Senator. She thought she could feel Han Sen's mind, and she didn't sense anything weird going on in his head. If he'd been plotting something devious, she should have been able to sense it. But Exquisite had grown suspicious. She distinctly remembered Han Sen knocking her unconscious. And even more importantly, when Han Sen knocked her out, she had no longer been able to sense what Han Sen was thinking. That made Exquisite suspicious about Han Sen's mind. She now worried that she didn't have full access to what was really going on in his head. Otherwise, even if she had passed out, she would have known what Han Sen was doing, and she could have prevented him from knocking her out in the first place. And the God Spirit Storm should have continued to follow Han Senator. Why had it waited until she was unconscious to retreat? The timing seemed terribly inconvenient. Han Sen, what did he do? Exquisite's mood was very conflicted, but she didn't mention her suspicions to Likir. When Han Sen found some alone time, he took out the 6 deified Geno cores and began studying them. Of the 6 deified genocores, 3 of them had a lightning element. 2 of them were fire, and 1 of them was ice. When most creatures refined genocores, they tended to select ones that matched their specific element. Otherwise, they would end up damaging their bodies by absorbing the power of an element that clashed with their innate power. But the elements of Han Sen's body were very balanced. None of his elements stood out more than any others, and he had some of everything. Therefore, he didn't have to be too picky with which elements he absorbed. He could refine any genocore he found with few complications. I think I will save these 3 lightning element genocores for Little Silver. I'm afraid his talents are a little lacking. If he refines these 3, his evolution should be expedited, and he'll be given the boost he needs to excel. Han Sen set the 3 lightning element genocores aside. There were 2 fire genocores and 1 that was ice. As he stared at the 3 genocores, Han Sen hesitated. He selected the ice genocore. After all, Jade Skin had connections to the ice element. It had grown more attuned to that power as he developed. He picked up the ice genocore. It was only the size of an adult's fist, but it looked like a big diamond with countless facets. It sparkled beautifully. Inside the genocore, falling snowflakes were visible. And somehow, those snowflakes seemed to outline a white, nearly transparent body. It was like a snow lady from a legend. I have heard that only deified elites can refine genocores. I wonder if I can do it right now. Still holding his ice genocore, Han Sen activated Jade Skin and tried to absorb the power of the genocore. The results were disappointing. Jade Skin was unable to refine the power of the genocore. The object sat in his palm, silent and unmoving. The easy way failed, so I guess we'll have to do this the hard way. Han Sen picked up the ice genocore, popped it into his mouth and swallowed it. Then he cast Consume. He was trying to force the ice genocore to break down. Consume had only just started running when Han Sen felt ice-cold power explode inside his stomach. It froze his stomach, then began to surge through the rest of his body. In the blink of an eye, Han Sen's entire body turned to ice. His whole form was enveloped in a sheet of ice. It was like he had been wrapped up in diamonds. Han Sen was shocked. He felt as if his life force itself was starting to solidify in the intense cold. He quickly cast Jade Skin to fight against the terrifyingly cold power. Jade Skin had high resistance against the cold. Even so, Han Sen's cells slowed so much that he thought they had stopped working. It made Han Sen feel as if he wanted to sleep. His eyelids were as heavy, as if he had gone several days without sleeping, and it was everything he could do to keep them from closing. He could have gone to sleep right where he was standing. In that drowsy state, Han Sen could faintly hear a woman's voice whispering near his ear, saying, "Go to sleep. Go to sleep." Her soothing voice almost pushed Han Sen into unconsciousness. Even though Jade Skin was running fitfully, he couldn't concentrate enough to keep it going. Oh no, this cold power has a relaxing effect, Han Sen thought, realizing what had happened. If he fell asleep now, there was a chance he might never wake up. I cannot go to sleep. I can't sleep no matter what. Right now, Jade Skin is barely keeping my life force chugging along. If I fall asleep, the cells of my body will freeze and put me into a deep sleep. It will be hard for me to wake up again, Han Sen warned himself. He told himself repeatedly to keep Jade Skin running. Although he knew he couldn't sleep, he was becoming more and more exhausted. He was going to fall asleep any second. His body was becoming weaker and weaker, and he needed to use his will to support himself. He couldn't let himself fall asleep, no matter what. Some indeterminate amount of time later, Han Sen felt the tiredness begin to fade. His mind became increasingly awake and aware. The cold finally receded, and his body started to feel warm again. Han Sen knew he had passed the hardest part of the trial, but that didn't mean he could let his vigilance falter. He kept casting Jade Skin, and he continued to absorb the foreign power. As Jade Skin absorbed that power, Han Sen noticed that it wasn't exhibiting any changes. The power was being absorbed, but it wasn't melting into Jade Skin as he had expected. Rather, it seemed to be remaining an independent power within Han Sen's body. Han Sen opened his eyes, and his heart stuttered. There were snowflake symbols on his skin, etched all across his body like tattoos. Han Sen could feel the power inside him, and he knew he could control it. But he couldn't use it quite like a normal genoart, or even incorporate its power into one of his own genoarts. Deified geno cores are pretty mystical. No wonder people sometimes call them talent skill stones. Right now, it's like I have an ice element deified skill. I don't know what this ice element skill can do, but I suppose it must have something to do with cold and sleep powers. Han Sen knew that if he used the Geno Art's power, it would require time to charge up again. It wasn't like a Geno Art that he could fuel continually with his own energy. Who should I use it on? Han Sen considered that question, but he couldn't find a suitable target. So, he put it out of his mind for the moment. He realized that he hadn't visited Horizontal Evil, which he had planned to do some time ago. Since Exquisite and Li Kier were not around, he decided to go back to that mysterious place to meet with Horizontal Evil again. Chapter 27:13 No God. After using the Four-Sheep Cube to go back to the mysterious realm, Han Sen immediately headed toward that big mountain. In his absence, the Break Skies had continued their unsuccessful efforts to excavate the mountain. When Han Sen arrived, Horizontal Evil was in the middle of his routine torture, courtesy of the metal pillar. Blood flew from the giant's chest as the metal pillar spun. When he saw Han Sen, Horizontal Evil frowned. What took you so long to come back? Something happened in the outside world, and it slowed me down. Han Sen didn't explain much. He changed the subject and said, I can continue our previous discussion if you'd like to talk about the universe. But Horizontal Evil stopped Han Sen from saying anything further. He said, listen up. I don't have much time, and there is something I would like you to do for me. And if you can do it, it will be a great benefit for you as well. What happened? Han Sen looked at Horizontal Evil with confusion. The giant seemed very upset. He was acting very differently than he had the last time Han Sen visited. Previously, Horizontal Evil was being tortured, but the man was able to keep his cool. Now he seemed like he was about to have some sort of breakdown. He looked as if he was holding it back, but Han Sen could sense that something was on the verge of happening. Horizontal Evil didn't answer Han Sen's question. He raised his head and let his face emerge from the unkempt hair. Do you believe God exists in this world? It was a solid face. Although it wasn't handsome, it was obviously trustworthy. But what Horizontal Evil said gave Han Sen a chill. For Han Sen, that question was one of the most annoying things in existence. He really didn't even know how to answer. Oh, I suppose you have already seen them? Horizontal Evil was surprised, having guessed this through Han Sen's reaction to the question. Yes, if the gods you are talking about are guys like King Jun, I have seen them. I even fought King Jun once before. Han Sen briefly told him about his trials against King Jun on Planet Eclipse, then the events after that. Horizontal Evil heard Han Sen's tale about killing the Sun Raven in front of King Jun and laughed. Awesome. This is awesome. I can't believe you ended up beating King Jun like that. Just this is enough for you and me to become good friends. Good. I feel safe in trusting this task to you. What is it? Han Sen asked hesitantly. Instead of answering, Horizontal Evil continued on his tangent. In this universe, beings like King Jun exist. To some creatures they are indeed gods. But to me they are less than a fart in the wind. Even if they are gods, so what? We the Break Skies will still defy and slay the gods. We will make them wet themselves. That is how one lives like a man, after all. The way Horizontal Evil spoke might not have been very polite, but it still excited Han Sen a lot. He agreed with Horizontal Evil's assessment of how men should behave. The giant went on to say, I will control my fate, and the fate of the Break Skies will be in my hand. No matter whether our opponents be gods or fairies, they will never make the Break Skies concede. Although Han Sen was still excited, he also felt a tinge of sadness flow through his heart. Can you tell me what happened exactly? Han Sen couldn't help but ask. Horizontal Evil still didn't answer him. He stared at Han Sen with fire in his eyes. A while later he said, This could be the final stand of our race. I shouldn't be asking this of you, but I have no choice now. And you are a crystallizer. That means we are allies, and therefore, I have to depend on you. This task will be very difficult. It might ruin the entire fate of your race and yourself. After this, you might become an enemy of the gods. Are you afraid? Horizontal Evil looked at Han Sen with fire in his eyes. I might obey God, but I don't obey self-proclaimed gods like King Jun, Han Sen answered. Haha, well said. Although you aren't like me, with disdain for the whole world, at least you are honest. Horizontal Evil laughed harder than ever. If you have some task to ask of me, and it is as dangerous as you say, could you at least explain it? Han Sen asked Horizontal Evil. Han Sen wasn't afraid of being King Jun's enemy. The gods already hated him, and that wouldn't change regardless of what Horizontal Evil asked him to do. In addition, he now wanted to find out where the gods came from, and what was going on with Sacred Leader and Horizontal Evil. Horizontal Evil's smile disappeared. He looked at Han Sen and said, Little brother, I can tell you that this world doesn't have a god. The self-proclaimed gods are creatures like you and I. The difference is that we are outside the Geno Hall, and they are inside it. When Han Sen heard this, he was delighted. He was close to finding out the truth. He didn't say anything. His eyes widened, begging Horizontal Evil to elaborate. He wanted to hear everything about the gods, so he could learn the truth behind these excruciating mysteries. Horizontal Evil paused, and then he said, Although there is just a difference of locale, their powers are indeed greater than ours. Our power can barely damage them, in fact. But there is one power that is the exception to this rule. Super Gene. Han Sen couldn't help but ask. Horizontal Evil thought Han Sen had heard the term through the conversation he last had with King Jun, so he didn't think too much about it. He nodded and said, That is correct. It is Super Gene. Having Super Gene enables you to kill these fake gods. But what is Super Gene? Han Sen asked. There is no answer to what it is. Horizontal Evil's answer surprised Han Sr. Why is there no answer? Han Sen asked in confusion. Horizontal Evil laughed and said, My good brother took to fighting those gods. We stumbled upon something that was able to hurt them, but hurting them was all we could do. We were never able to kill the gods with it. So, we investigated our discovery, and came to the conclusion that it was called Super Gene. We needed our bodies to contain the Super Gene, so that we could fight the gods in the Geno Hall, and kill them for good. Before Han Sen could put a word in, Horizontal Evil went on to say, I have yet to succeed, so I cannot tell you the true nature of Super Gene. But there is something that I can give you. With it you can begin to unravel the truth for yourself. If you are lucky enough, you might be able to find out what Super Gene truly is. If you aren't lucky, pass it on to others, until someone is finally able to learn what Super Gene really is. When Han Sen heard this, his body shook. The good brother, Horizontal Evil mentioned, might have been Sacred Leader. Han Sen thought the thing he needed was in Sacred Leader's hands. But he hadn't expected Horizontal Evil to actually be in control of the secret. And he was now going to give it to Han Sr. Chapter 27:14 Horizontal Evil strikes Sun. Horizontal Evil fell silent and lifted his hands. He grabbed the metal pillar that was drilling into his chest, then slowly began to push it up and away from his body. Because of what Horizontal Evil was doing, the metal pillar began to shine. It shook in his hands, as if it was desperately trying to keep drilling into him. But Horizontal Evil had the pillar solidly in his grip now. No matter how brightly the pillar shone, or how much it wanted to burrow back into him, Horizontal Evil was still able to remove it with his hands. Boom! When the last of the metal came free of Horizontal Evil's chest, Han Sen finally realized that the metal pillar was actually a giant spear. That spear was writhing like a snake in Horizontal Evil's hands. It seemed to be trying to escape from his clutches, but the giant bore down hard, pinning the spear in place. Horizontal Evil toppled from the mountain, and Han Sen thought, if you had the power to free yourself, why have you remained trapped here for so many years? And all those breaks guys were kept here for many years trying to free you. After Horizontal Evil escaped, the wounds on his chest quickly healed. The gaping edges of the gashes pulled closed, and soon after, there was not a single mark left on his chest. But once Horizontal Evil was free, the mountain began to shake. It wasn't just the mountain either. The ocean that spread around them, as far the eye could see, began to grow turbulent and wild. It was like the world was ending. Horizontal Evil stood upon the waves of the sea. He gripped the spear in his hands, and he roared defiantly to the sky. His voice made the whole realm become even shakier. Han's son had been flying, but the sheer volume of the noise knocked him out of the sky. "Stop shouting! I'm going to die." Han's son felt as if his chest was filling up with blood due to the noise. 11 of his organs felt like they were about to be torn apart. He had to use all of his power to fight against the damaging acoustics, but nothing he did seemed to help. Han's son's voice was like an ant's compared to that thundering roar. No matter how much he shouted, he couldn't even hear himself. Just as Han's son thought he was going to die because of that shouting, Horizontal Evil finally stopped. Han's son felt instant relief. He coughed, and dark blood bubbled over his lips. He straightened back up to see Horizontal Evil looking at him. He thought the giant was going to say something, but Horizontal Evil merely lifted the spear, turned the point toward his chest, and slammed the weapon through his heart. The blade punched straight through Horizontal Evil's heart again, but he didn't seem to care. After he pulled the spear back out, he put his hand into the wound. He searched around a little, then pulled something out. "Take it. From now on, every god in existence will be your enemy. Whether you like it or not, this is your fate. And it is a fate you can no longer escape from." Horizontal Evil opened his fist, and something that looked like a meteor came flying toward Han's senator. When Han's son saw the speed and massive power of the item flying toward him, his heart leaped into his throat. He moved to catch the item, but when it landed in his hands, it touched his skin as gently as a feather. Han's son knew that it was Horizontal Evil controlling the flight of the item, so he wasn't too surprised. But when he opened his hands and had a look at that thing, Han's son's breath caught in his chest. He stared at his hands in dumbfounded awe. Han's son was holding a black crystal. He was familiar with its shape, size, and weight. In some ways, no one could be more familiar with it than he was. The black crystal was the same as the one he had taken from the black armor bug's belly so long ago. If Han's son hadn't already absorbed that black crystal and received the black crystal armor from it, he would have thought it was the exact same. What's going on? The thing Horizontal Evil has been referencing is the black crystal. Is this black crystal the same as the one I found inside the sanctuaries? Does this also contain a black crystal armor? Han's son's mind was in shambles, and he tried to formulate thoughts on this revelation. You should leave now. After this life, there will be no more Horizontal Evil. The break skies will no longer exist. Horizontal Evil's eyes looked as if they were on fire, and he turned to look up toward the sun clock in the sky. Han's son didn't ask anything more of the man. Horizontal Evil suddenly jumped, broke space, and shot toward the sun perched in the sky. The metal spear he held was raised and pointed at the sun clock. Now finally, Han's son understood some of what was happening in this strange world. The break skies had been digging the mountain all their lives, hoping to save Horizontal Evil. But Horizontal Evil had allowed himself to be pinned to the mountain because of them. He let himself be tortured. He had the power to escape, but if he escaped, the giants of that world would die. That was why Horizontal Evil had been there the whole time. When Han's son flew away from the mountain and found himself among the palaces, he found that they were no longer protected from the waves. The giant walls of water battered the palaces, slowly pulling them down in the deep. The flesh of the giants was sloughing off as Han's son watched, leaving only gaunt skeletal remains behind. What a cruel curse. This is so sick. Horizontal Evil had to remain trapped in order for them to live. And if he escaped, they would rot down to their bones in minutes. Horizontal Evil didn't want to see his people become extinct. But who knows how long he was tortured on that mountain. Dead or alive, his entire existence had become pain. This must be the most horrible torture ever. Han's son sighed. He didn't want to see those giant bones anymore. He flew fast toward the four-sheep cube. Boom! Before Han's son could reach the four-sheep cube, he heard an explosion. Bright light covered everything around him. Within that shiny explosion, he couldn't even see his fingers. The shockwave rocked the entire dimension. It was like the landscape had been turned on its head, with the water now up in the sky. Han Sun cast his purple-eye butterfly as he looked up. The weird sun clock in the sky had been cracked, and horizontal evil was rushing forward, still holding the spear. Waves of fire washed out of the broken sun clock like tsunamis. Han Sun knew instantly that the power he was witnessing was greater than what a deified elite could unleash at max power. Han Sun didn't dare remain. He accelerated hard, racing toward the four-sheep cube. After guarding the red dust for 1 billion years, one spear breaks the sky to slay a ghost and god, horizontal evil shouted. His voice echoed throughout the realm, but Han Sun could no longer see him. The waves of fire swept across the sky, but Han Sun didn't dare slow down to watch. Although he had many more questions he wished to ask horizontal evil, he wouldn't have the chance to do that now. He glanced at the strange scene in the sky one last time, as he stepped on the bronze sheep head. Then, he teleported away from that mysterious world, through the four-sheep cube. Han Sun wanted to know what happened to horizontal evil in the end, but he couldn't go back. He held the black crystal, and his heart felt sick and saddened. This black crystal, is it really like the first one I found? Han Sun rubbed the black crystal with his fingers. That feeling was so real. It couldn't be fake. Chapter 27:15 Gru's Invitation. It's a shame I can't go back to the sanctuaries right now. Otherwise, I could grab a creature and feed this crystal to it. Then, I could confirm that this is really the same black crystal I found a long time ago, Han Sun said after a think. Suddenly, Han Sun's eyes brightened with a thought. I don't have access to the creatures of the sanctuary, but there are xenogenics within range. If I grab one and use it to test the crystal, it might yield the same results. Once Han Sun decided what to do, he didn't have to go far to test his theory. He would just grab a king-class star beetle from the star tree. Han Sun arrived at the star tree a short time later, but after half a day of searching, he failed to find a single star beetle. Since star beetles were no longer an option, Han Sun tried to decide where else he might look. It looks like the star beetles aren't back yet, he murmured to himself. I guess I will forget about continuing my search for them. Han Sun jerked his head up as he noticed a presence approaching the star tree. When the distant figure drew closer, he recognized that it was Gru from the Extreme King. This is the star tree. Without the leader's permission, you cannot enter here, Han Sun said, blocking Gru's passage. In fact, Han Sun didn't actually have to warn the man. There was a seal around the star tree already. If any creature entered the area without permission, an alarm would be triggered. I was looking for you at Underworld Lake, Gru answered. I couldn't find you there, so I thought you might be here. It looks like I was correct. Why have you come looking for me? Han Sun asked, keeping his face carefully neutral. There was a deep-seated grudge between him and the Extreme King. If an Extreme King like Gru had come looking for him, that was reason enough for him to be wary. Gru smiled. Please don't misunderstand me. I mean no harm. My people do have a grudge with you, but not all of us think it is a matter that must be resolved with bloodshed. Han Sun knew instantly what Gru meant. There were many factions within the Extreme King. The strongest faction was the Bai family, the group led by King Bai. There was also the Bao faction, which Han Sun had recently become familiar with. They were from King Bao's bloodline. Although they were no longer true royalty, the Bao family still had a lot of influence over the hearts and minds of the Extreme King. There were other groups in addition to those two noble factions as well. The political situation within the Extreme King was quite complicated, and being an outsider, Han Sun had never been able to fully grasp the way things worked there. Han Sun didn't know which faction Gru belonged to, but it sounded as if his party had little interest in troubling Han Senator, or at the very least, they weren't interested in actively starting a conflict. What is it then? Han Sun had almost killed Gru in the silkworm bout. He didn't think Gru would be generous enough to forget about all that and come over for a nice conversation. Gru looked serious as he said, I have found a lone primitive deified. I'm not confident in my ability to kill it by myself, so I was hoping we could kill it together. That doesn't sound like a good idea, Han Sun said after some hesitation. There was absolutely no trust between the two men, and on top of that, they had been enemies the last time they met. Even if they were friendly with each other, it was always difficult for two people to decide how to split the loot obtained from slaying a deified creature. Gru could see what Han Sun was worrying about, and so he said, "You might not believe me, but I truly mean you no harm. I actually admire you, truth be told. That's why I am inviting you to slay a Xenogeniac with me. I can't do it myself, and I would like to see your knife skills again. I want to learn from you. In regards to the loot, that's no cause for concern. Whatever rewards we obtain, we can split them evenly between us. Half and half." Han Sun gazed at Gru without speaking. He was still hesitating. There were outliers like Gru among the Extreme King. People who truly weren't bothered by who Han Sun was, or the things he had done. However, Han Sun had no way of finding out if Gru truly felt that way. This might be some secret ploy for revenge. If he went with Gru, he might be walking into a trap. After spending some more time thinking about it, Han Sun decided to reject Gru's offer. "I'm sorry, but I have other things to do. I can't go and hunt Xenogeniacs with you." Gru looked disappointed, but he understood what Han Sun was worried about. He nodded and said, "Then I won't try to force you to join me. If you decide that you want to hunt a Xenogeniac, you can always come and find me." After watching Gru take his leave, Han Sun pulled out a map of outer sky. The entirety of outer sky was far too large to be represented by such a small map, so only a small part of the domain had been drawn. It included the living quarters of the Very High, the Star Tree and Underworld Lake. Those were places Han Sun was already familiar with. There were some markings on it that Han Sun had never visited though. They referred to places where scary Xenogeniacs could be found. Han Sun examined the map for a while. He found a place close to the Star Tree that was called Full Moon River. He decided to go there to grab a king-class Xenogeniac to test the black crystal. He had briefly considered swallowing the black crystal to test it on himself, but he had quickly concluded taking such a rash action would be foolish. There were many scary Xenogeniacs in outer sky, but places that were close to the living spaces of the Very High only had Xenogeniacs that were king-class and below. Full Moon River was one such place. There were no deifieds there, but the river region did contain many kings. One of them would be perfect for Han Sun to capture and use as a test subject. Han Sun flew in over Full Moon River, examining the area from high in the sky. The nearby terrain rolled in a series of low-lying hills that spread far away from the river. Han Sun had only just arrived at the Full Moon River when he saw a rhino Xenogeniac standing atop a cliff. The snow-white creature was staring down the ravine. Han Sun couldn't tell what it was looking for. Han Sun followed the beast's gaze, but there were only clouds down below. They were too thick for anything to be seen through them. While Han Sun was wondering what was going on, he saw some movement within the clouds. A new Xenogeniac, which looked like some strange hybrid of a fish and a snake, flew out of the clouds. The Xenogeniac was like a giant snake with horns on its head. It didn't have any claws, but wings spread from its back. It was a very odd-looking creature. When it flew out of the clouds, it screamed at the rhino that was on the cliff. The rhino and the flying snake were soon fighting on the cliffside. Han Sun could see that neither of them was very strong. They were just second or third tier kings. This fight wouldn't be very interesting to watch. He planned to wait until one was injured before he picked one and conducted his test. But after Han Sun watched them for a while, he was given a shock. The rhino's skin was super thick, and it had the power to petrify. It was so hard that it was like nothing Han Sun had ever seen at that level. But the weird snake's area power was also a surprise. The weird snake was also white. Its body wasn't made out of the jade-like material that composed the rhino, but it glowed with some sort of blurry light. The light formed a large seal around it. Within that seal, regardless of how much damage the rhino dealt to it, the snake could heal all wounds. In fact, its injuries closed so quickly that Han Sun could barely track the healing power with his eyes. There is an area power that heals? Han Sun murmured to himself. That sort of area power was rare. Han Sun, why are you here? Han Sun was continuing to focus on the fight when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw someone flying toward him. The figure was waving to him from afar. It was Gru, whom he had just turned away earlier. I'm here on business. Why are you here? Hansen asked. The deified Xenogeniac I mentioned is around here. Since you said you were busy, I thought I would go and try to take it down myself. I didn't expect to meet you here though. What a coincidence. Gru smiled. Chapter 27:16 Immortal Dragon. It seems very unlikely that this meeting has happened by chance, Hansen thought in his heart. Gru didn't know what Hansen was thinking though. He looked down at the two Xenogeniacs and said, a moon rhino and an immortal dragon. They are rare Xenogeniacs, but it is a shame they are only king class. If they were deified, they would be worth a lot of money. That would be especially true of the immortal dragon. If an immortal dragon can become deified, then its substance chains can make others practically immortal as well. For as long as the immortal dragon retains its power, anyone it has vowed to protect is essentially unkillable. It is a shame that deified immortal dragons are incredibly rare. In all the history I have learned, I have only heard of 3 deified immortal dragons. Their powers aren't sufficient at king class? Hansen asked with curiosity. Gru shook his head. King class immortal dragons have a decent area power, but the ability is only useful for healing some external trauma. For most elites, that isn't very useful. Taming one of the creatures for that ability alone is hardly worth it. Deified immortal dragons are a different story, however. They can keep you alive in all sorts of situations. Many deified elites would like to have a deified immortal dragon. Anyone would want something that has the potential to save their lives. When he heard Gru say this, Hansen's heart jumped. He thought to himself, it is very lucky that I found this immortal dragon to use in my test. If the black crystal really works, maybe I can get a deified immortal dragon. Brother Han, the deified Xenogeniac I want to kill is in Full Moon River. It is only 200 miles from here. If you have the time, maybe we can go there? Gru said hopefully to Han Sr. I want to get a Xenogeniac as a mount. Based on what you've told me, the immortal dragon doesn't seem too bad. I think I'll capture that immortal dragon. Once I have the immortal dragon, if you still haven't killed the deified Xenogeniac on your own, I can go as well to help you out. If Gru's Xenogeniac was really that nearby, Hansen wouldn't mind going after it. Sure, I will stay here and wait for you. It is just an immortal dragon, so I am sure you will get it easily. Gru smiled. Hansen didn't care if the man stayed. It would only be a matter of time before others found out he was catching a Xenogeniac. There was no way to hide it, but neither was there a need to. The two of them waited where they were for a while. The immortal dragon was beating the pulp out of the moon rhino. With its immortal area active, the immortal dragon was impervious to the rhino's attacks. In the end, Hansen and Gru watched the immortal dragon open its mouth and choke down the badly injured moon rhino. The rhino's body was much bigger than the immortal dragon's body. After the immortal dragon swallowed its foe, its body expanded like a big balloon. Hansen wondered if the dragon could actually digest something so large. But for Hansen, this was a very good opportunity. The immortal dragon had eaten the entire moon rhino, and it was now settling down to digest its meal. It wasn't paying much attention to its surroundings. Hansen flew toward it and fired out an array of silks from his knife. Hansen lifted his finger, and the knife silks tied up the immortal dragon. Immortal dragon was terrified. It shivered in fear, but when it tried to run away, the knife silks tightened and cut into the creature's body. Although its area was obscenely powerful, it wouldn't help much if the dragon sliced itself into pieces. Once it had recovered, the creature tried to struggle free again. It was worried about being cut though. Eventually, the immortal dragon realized that it couldn't escape the knife silks without killing itself. It stopped moving, carefully trying not to touch the knife silks circling its body. It seems to be fairly intelligent, Hansen said with a laugh. And then, he lifted a hand and drew slowly on the knife silks. The immortal dragon immediately responded to the tug, slithering forward across the ground to keep the silks from drawing tight again. But the moon rhino was still in the creature's belly. The roundness of its stomach made it difficult for the immortal dragon to slither forward. It moved way too slow, and the knife silks cut into the beast's scales. Each cut caused the creature to release a nasty screech. You are good, Brother Han. The power to create these silks and control them with masterful precision. You aren't too far off the talent of a genuine deified elite, Gru complimented him. You're laying it on thick. Han Sun was still suspicious that Gru might be harboring ulterior motives. Even if Gru wasn't a part of the Bai family, there were many within the extreme king that hated Han. Senator Han Sun doubted that Gru was as detached as he seemed. But now that he had agreed to go with Gru, he no longer had an excuse to delay their venture. He left the immortal dragon trapped in the knife silks. Every hour the fiend spent in captivity would grind at its mind. Han Sun then turned to follow Gru deep up Full Moon River. Han Sun still suspected that Gru might have a conspiracy up his sleeve, but when they reached their destination, Han Sun was relieved to find that there really was a deified xenogeniac on the riverbank. That xenogeniac looked like a wolf. Its hair was gray, but it had 4 eyes. Its fangs were like hooks. The beast looked extremely evil. As they made their way up the river, Gru had told Han Sun that the deified xenogeniac was talented with eye skills. Its eyes released an indestructible godlight. The creature's attacks were shockingly fast. Gru wouldn't have lasted long on his own. The 4-eyed wolf saw Gru, and it howled angrily and got to its feet. Its 4 eyes opened wide, and a weird green light began to glow inside them. The beast suddenly released 4 green beams that shot right toward Gru. Clearly, the 4-eyed wolf really hated Gru. It was obvious that this wasn't the first time Gru had come to challenge the beast. Gru already had experience dealing with the wolf. When he saw the creature's 4 green lights coming, he pulled out a shield and used it to protect his body. Gru's shield looked oddly fragile. It resembled a silver mirror, and it seemed like a single punch would be enough to crack it. But when those 4 scary substance chains struck the weird shield, the reflective surface of the glass bounced them away. Gru remained unharmed. What a strong shield, Han Sun said in praise. Gru was half deified, and yet he was able to use his shield to deflect the substance chains of a deified xenogeniac without much difficulty. Clearly, the strange shield was something truly unique. Gru laughed. Mr. Sun lent me this deified treasure. This shield can deflect eye skills and visual skills. I borrowed it so I could deal with this 4-eyed wolf. It is embarrassing, but the mirror shield can only block the 4-eyed wolf's eye lights. It does not, however, lend me additional speed, and I still can't block the creature's physical attacks. I cannot hurt it, and yet it almost kills me each time. After pausing, Gru looked at Han Sun and said, Brother Han, you have the Apollo set. With the speed gifted to you by the armor's wings, you should be able to keep up with the wolf. When it uses its eye lights again, I will use the mirror shield to block. Then, you take that opportunity to swoop in and strike. Sure. Han Sun nodded. However, Han Sun was silently thinking, I have just absorbed the Ice Geno core, which should have given me some new powers. Now I can give it a spin and see what it does. Chapter 27:17 Scary Ice Geno Art. The godlights that came from the wolf's eyes shot toward Gru like 4 bolts of lightning. Gru remained stalwart though. He had already prepared his defense. And when the 4-eyed wolf unleashed the attack, Gru lifted his mirror shield. The green godlights slammed straight into the mirror shield, but they were reflected away. The attack was unable to damage the shield, and as he watched, Han Sun felt a little bit jealous. Before the 4-eyed wolf could gather its power to attack again, Han Sun made his move. He immediately activated the Ice Geno art that he had recently received. Snowflakes crusted over his body, and he unleashed snow substance chains that headed straight for the 4-eyed wolf. The 4-eyed wolf had just used its eye skills, so it didn't have much of a chance of avoiding the snowy substance chains. A new light flashed across its body as it tried to block the attack. The snowy air didn't seem to be affected though. Han Sun's icy power wrapped around the 4-eyed wolf. If seen from afar, it would have looked like a half-transparent snow lady covering up the giant wolf. The snow power didn't immediately freeze the 4-eyed wolf. The green light still shone around the wolf's body, and its substance chains fought against the snow power. Is that all the strength that this Ice Geno art can unleash? Han Sun was disappointed. This was similar to what he could do when he had his Apollo set. The attack was nothing special, and the ice power wasn't very strong. It fell far short of his expectations, that was for sure. He had only attacked once, and the Ice Geno Core's power was already exhausted. He would have to wait a long time before he could even use it again anyway. It wasn't as good as the Apollo set, which was far more convenient. If this was all the Ice Geno Core could accomplish, then there was no reason for him to continue practicing with the Ice Geno Core. He could just keep on using his Apollo set. The snow air seemed to be growing a little more intense as time went on. But overall, the strike was unable to freeze the four-eyed wolf. Hansen thought it was all over. After all, the four-eyed wolf had easily held off the attack. When the wolf summoned more of its strength, it would obliterate the snow power. But things developed in an unexpected way. The four-eyed wolf's attempts to fight off the snow power did not increase. Instead, they weakened, and Hansen's icy power affected the creature more and more. Hansen was shocked. As he watched, the wolf's four eyes seemed to flutter. It looked very sleepy. The creature was going to fall asleep any second. Does the ice power have a tranquilizing effect as well? Hansen was happy about this. The four-eyed wolf could block the ice, but it couldn't resist the lulling power. Its will began to fade. The green light became dimmer and dimmer. The creature couldn't break the ice power that held it captive. The ice power wasn't a raging, destructive attack. It just lowered the target's body temperature. The wolf grew chillier bit by bit. Not long after, the four-eyed wolf succumbed entirely to the sedative. It closed its eyes, went to sleep, and froze like an ice statue. Gru was staring at the wolf in undisguised shock. He turned and looked at Hansen for a long while before saying in an odd tone, "This is a very powerful ice geno art. It has already generated substance chains too. Has that geno art reached a deified level?" Hansen nodded. "I got lucky when I received it. I managed to get my hands on a deified geno core. And fortunately, I was able to refine it and receive this ice geno art." Gru was more interested, and he said, "So the power came from a deified geno core? Deified geno cores are so rare. Even the Extreme King count themselves incredibly lucky to lay claim to one. And even then, only deified elites can learn the deified geno arts that the cores offer. Your luck is too much. This is nothing. With the powers of the Extreme King, I am sure Brother Gru will be able to get deified geno cores easily, right?" Hansen responded coldly. "I would have trouble getting a deified geno core. And even if I somehow got one, I wouldn't be able to absorb it before becoming deified." After saying that, Gru fell silent. Then he walked to the four-eyed wolf. Now that it was solidly encased in ice, the four-eyed wolf was soundly asleep. However, the freezing power hadn't actually killed the creature. It still had a life force. "It looks like I will have to ask Brother Han to kill it," Gru said. Hansen had no reason to refuse. If he used his Apollo set, he should have a sufficient amount of power to strike down the four-eyed wolf. Plus, the creature could no longer move. It couldn't even generate a power to block Hansen's attack. The power of the Apollo set was unleashed. Hansen slashed toward the sleeping four-eyed wolf, cutting deeply into the side of the creature's neck. No blood leaked from the wound, however. The blood was all frozen. Despite being attacked and badly injured, the four-eyed wolf didn't even wake up. Rather than howling in pain, it remained in a deep slumber. It took Hansen 4 slashes to cut the wolf's head off. Then the four-eyed wolf's life force disappeared. Deified Xenogeniac killed, four-eyed wolf. Xenogeniac gene found. This ice geno art is so powerful. It has both ice and sedative powers? It is very good. Hansen was happy with its performance. He was now thinking about refining the 2 fire geno cores he had received. Gru complimented Hansen's good luck in obtaining a new, powerful deified geno art. But he also looked annoyed and he said, "I wanted to see more of your knife skills, but it seems that I didn't get the chance." "You can see the knife skills whenever. Killing the Xenogeniac is what matters. According to our deal, I'm getting half of this four-eyed wolf's Xenogeniac gene, right?" Hansen said. "Of course," Gru said with a nod. Hansen used his power to cut the four-eyed wolf in half. Each of them had half of the wolf's body to take home with them. Once their hunt was finished, Hansen went back to where the immortal dragon was trapped. He found it still lying there unmoving. It was very afraid of the knife silks. Hansen's silks seemed to have caused the creature a great deal of pain. Han-sun removed the knife silks. After Gru said his goodbyes, Han-sun took the immortal dragon back to the star tree. While there was no one around, Han-sun brought out the black crystal and fed it to the immortal dragon. The immortal dragon didn't want to open its mouth, so Han-sun summoned more knife silks and cinched them tight around the creature. The knife silks dug painfully into the immortal dragon's body, and the beast couldn't help but scream. In doing so, it opened its mouth. Han-sun tossed the black crystal into the dragon's mouth. As soon as he saw the beast swallow, he released the knife silks. If this doesn't work on a xenogeniac, I will have to use it on a creature from the sanctuaries. Han-sun watched the beast lying flat on the ground. The creature seemed to have been utterly beaten down body and soul. After 2 days, Han-sun saw something surprising happen. The scales of the immortal dragon began to fall off. And then, new scales appeared across its flesh. These scales were made of crystal, and more importantly, substance chains began to rise from the scales. Although the substance chains weren't complete yet, it was a very clear sign. The black crystal can really make the immortal dragon deified? Han-sun was as shocked as he was happy. Chapter 27 18 Geno Protoplasm. In a few short days, the immortal dragon's appearance changed dramatically. It was like a snake peeling away a layer of its skin. The scales kept falling away, and its body grew smaller and smaller each time it molted. But as its body shrank, the substance chains rising from its scales grew more defined. The process of leveling up to deified seemed to be going as smooth as butter. If the black crystal can immediately elevate a xenogeniac to deified, that is so scary. The fact that the black crystal could affect creatures in the sanctuaries was impressive, but it wasn't too shocking. Those creatures have good genes, but their life energy is low. The energy necessary for a king-class xenogeniac to become deified is daunting though. In elevating the immortal dragon to deified in just a few short days, the black crystal has revealed that it contains a truly terrifying amount of power. Han-sun thought to himself. He was in shock. Although Han-sun had set the test up himself, he was still struggling to come to terms with its success. The immortal dragon's body continued to change, and on the 10th day, the creature looked like it was made out of crystal. Its body shone and glittered in the light. Its body glowed with power as it merrily generated substance chains. All around the beast, the plants began to grow like mad. Han-sun stared at the sight in awe. It looks like the immortal dragon is really becoming deified, Han-sun thought. Then he saw the immortal dragon raise its head in pain. It let out a strange screech, and its holy substance chains erupted like a volcano. Is it going to level up now? The holy light substance chains wrapped entirely around the immortal dragon, and the creature looked like a small sun. Han-sun had to squint slightly, but he still couldn't see through that blinding light. He could only feel where the immortal dragon was. It had scary energy swirling around it like a nuclear reactor. Han-sun had to teleport some distance away from the immortal dragon to keep from being injured by the intensity of that light. A few minutes later, the scary power started to fade away. When the holy light dimmed enough for Han-sun to see the immortal dragon again, his jaw fell open. The immortal dragon was gone. There was only the black crystal remaining, in the precise spot the immortal dragon had been moments before. What is this? Still reeling, Han-sun summoned his purple-eye butterfly and checked out the area surrounding the black crystal. The immortal dragon was not there. All traces of the immortal dragon had vanished, as if the creature had entirely disappeared. Aside from the black crystal, there was nothing left. Even the snake scales that had littered the ground had vanished. Han-sun carefully walked next to the black crystal. He looked at the black crystal, and noticed that although it still looked pretty much the same, he could see something within its crystalline depths. There was a shadow fading away inside the crystal, and it seemed to resemble the immortal dragon. It happened within the blink of an eye. The immortal dragon's shadow disappeared, and the black crystal returned to looking like it had before. It was as if nothing had happened at all. How could this happen? Han-sun shivered slightly. He was secretly happy though. It is lucky I didn't eat the black crystal myself. If I had, I might have ended up like that immortal dragon. It looks like this black crystal is different from the one I found before. Han Sen stared at the black crystal on the floor, but he didn't dare touch it. What had just happened was way too weird. As he looked at the black crystal, it suddenly began to move. It bounced violently around on the ground like a bean in an earthquake. Catcha! After a moment of that, the black crystal suddenly opened. Han Sen was watching the black crystal the entire time, but he still couldn't have described the dimension-bending way in which the crystal changed. It might almost have been more accurate to say that the crystal simply transformed. A minute of startled silence later, Han Sen realized that the black crystal was starting to resemble the immortal dragon. But while the original immortal dragon had been snow white, this new immortal dragon was colored the same, bottomless black of the crystal. The black crystal continued to change, refining the form of the dragon. In the end, a living immortal dragon shaped from black flesh stood in front of Han Senator the next second. The black crystal dragon opened its eyes and locked onto Han Sen with an unreadable stare. Han Sen stared back at the creature. He had no idea what was going on. He didn't even know if it was the same immortal dragon. A man and a dragon just gazed at each other for some time. Neither of them did anything. In Han Sen's Sea of Soul, the sleeping black crystal armor suddenly activated. It flew out of Han Sen's Sea of Soul and grabbed the immortal dragon that had once been a black crystal. The immortal dragon didn't try to resist as the black crystal armor grabbed it. A miraculous scene began to unfold. As the black crystal armor touched the black dragon, the dragon returned to looking like a crystal again. Before Han Sen could figure out what was going on, the black crystal armor had flown back into Han Sen's Sea of Soul, still holding the black crystal. At the same time, the black crystal unleashed a mysterious power that sealed Han Sen's body and his Sea of Soul. To anyone looking at Han Sen from the outside, his power would now seem dim and uninteresting. Only Jadeskin's power seemed to reside within him. Han Sen was suspicious. He didn't know what the black crystal armor was doing, but he knew the black crystal armor wouldn't have taken action without good reason. In the past, the armor had only activated when there was a dire need for its aid. Those situations were often related to the Geno Hall. As Han Sen frowned, he saw someone approaching from far away. In a moment, the man was only a few steps away from the star tree. When Han Sen saw the person's face, he was shocked. The man looked like one of the very high, but Han Sen knew that he wasn't. Han Sen recognized the man's face. When Han Sen and Li Qier had entered the Destiny's Tower in the desert, he met a statue of a god that called himself Empty God. The statue had the same face as this man, but the god statue's presence was nothing like the being that was standing in front of him now. Although they looked exactly the same, this man had an unmistakable presence. If the god statue had been sitting next to him, no matter how alike they looked, the god statue would seem like little more than a servant. This can't be Empty God's true body, can it? Han Sen's heart jumped. He suddenly understood why the black crystal armor had gone into hiding. Weird. Earlier, I sensed genoprotoplasm. Where has it gone now? Did someone else get here first? No way. This area belongs to me. There's no way that one of those guys sensed it sooner than I did. Empty God frowned. Then he looked at Han Sen, who was sitting under the tree. Have you seen a weird creature around here? Empty God asked, walking up to Han Sr. What weird creature? Han Sen asked back. Empty God frowned. He shouldn't have asked that question. There was no point. Even if some creature in this universe had seen the genoprotoplasm, they wouldn't have recognized it. Well, since a god is now here, it is your lucky day. I can fulfill any wish you desire. Speak one wish, and I will make it come true for you. Empty God looked arrogantly down on Han Sr. Chapter 27:19 Empty God's Decision. You are God? Han Sen asked, pretending to be shocked. Yes, I am God. I can do anything. Empty God confirmed, his face unchanging. But my parents told me that this world has no God, and that science is the truth. Han Sen gave Empty God a look that was very skeptical. In that case, your parents are ignorant. Empty God looked at Han Sen and went on to say, You are a crystallizer. It is no surprise that you think this way. You learn a thing or two about how the universe works, and then poof, you think you know it all. What a foolish bunch of people. Empty God clearly thought Han Sen was stupid. He coldly went on. You can make any wish you want. You can, for example, wish to become deified. You can wish for a deified treasure that is of a very high level. Or you can even wish to become the master of outer sky. I can satisfy your wishes and show you what a real god can do. Han Sen blinked. He looked innocent and said, I don't need any of that stuff. Don't you want to be the strongest fighter of your lifetime? Do you not want to claim the universe for yourself? For me, giving you such power would be a piece of cake. If you make a wish, I can make it come true for you. Empty God said, trying to tempt Han Sr. Yes, but what would I need any of that stuff for? Han Sen asked Empty God again, looking confused. Empty God seemed prepared to answer the same question many times. Then you can have anything you want. The pretty women of every race will become your toys. The elites of every race will become your slaves. You can be the leader of the entire universe. The creatures in the universe will obey you and fear you. This sounds pretty lame. I don't want any of that. Han Sen didn't want to make a wish like that. Not to mention that if he did make such an expensive request, Empty God would probably pick his bones clean in taking payment. Then, what would you like? Empty God asked with a frown. This man in front of him seemed pretty dumb, but the simpleton was harder to tempt and convince than most. I'm very happy with the way I am now, thank you. I don't need anything. If you really are God, you should save these wishes and spend them on the people who are really suffering and require the help. Han Sen said to Empty God in the most condescending tone that he could manage. He knew that gods like King Jun couldn't directly attack beings of the universe, so he wasn't really afraid of what Empty God could do to him. Empty God's face darkened. Whenever he encountered people of this universe, he always found a way to make them wish for something. But on this particular day, he was intent on finding the genoprotoplasm. He wasn't in the mood to waste time talking to Han Senator after staring coldly at Han Sen for a second. He turned away and ignored Han Senator. He wanted to walk around and see if he could find a lead on the genoprotoplasm. When he saw Empty God taking his leave, Han Sen suppressed a sigh of relief. But the black crystal was still keeping his sea of soul and body locked down. It was too soon to be happy, because Empty God was still around. If you are refusing to leave, then I will instead, Han Sen thought. He would stay away from the star tree until Empty God decided to leave as well. But Han Sen hadn't been flying away from the star tree for long when he saw Empty God appear in front of him again. He was coming toward Han Senator. Empty God had found no sign of the genoprotoplasm anywhere, so he had come back for Han Senator. Han Sen was the only person in the area. If there was genoprotoplasm in the vicinity, Han Sen was the likeliest person to have seen it. Empty God wasn't happy about being unable to read Han Sen's mind. Han Sen's face remained expressionless. He kept going forward. He was neither fast nor slow. He didn't want Empty God to become suspicious of him. When Empty God was near enough that Han Sen could hear him, he spoke again. Have you considered my offer? You still have the chance to make a wish. I really don't have a wish I want to make right now. You should go and ask someone else, Han Sen said. Then, he tried to maneuver past Empty God. I've asked you to make a wish, so make a wish. Stop talking crap. Empty God's face looked icy. He waved his hand, tearing a frightening rip in the fabric of space. Han Sen felt as if the world was shattering in front of him. Empty God was a rather foul-tempered individual. At least King Jun usually tried to trick Han Sen, but Empty God couldn't even be bothered to make the effort. He was just trying to blackmail Han Senator. Han Sen wasn't about to let himself be intimidated though. He understood the nature and some of the limitations of these self-proclaimed gods. He wouldn't be pushed around that easily. It seems that you don't know me very well. It doesn't matter how badly you want me to make a wish, because I'm not going to do it. What can you do to me, huh? If you really are God, you should be able to kill me pretty easily, Han Sen growled, his expression unyielding. Empty God looked surprised. Tearing space open with his bare hands should have startled Han Sen out of his wits. Even deifieds would be shocked speechless by Empty God's power. But somehow, this brainless person was wholly unfazed by his display of strength. It made Empty God unsure of what to do. If he had been able to attack, Empty God would have slapped Han Sen to death and stolen his memory. But he couldn't attack Han Sen like that. Not in this universe, at least. Very good. Empty God didn't say another word. He turned and left, vanishing after a few steps. And then the broken space returned to normal. These guys really can't do anything in the Geno universe. Maybe there are certain conditions that render them unable to attack. But even so, it means I'll be alright even if all the gods become my enemies. As long as I don't make a wish, they can't do anything to me, Han Sen thought to himself. But the black crystal armor still hadn't released the seal on his body. So Han Sen knew that Empty God hadn't truly left the vicinity. Han Sen returned to the star tree, but Empty God remained hidden. Not long after, Exquisite and Li Kier brought Bauer with them to the star tree. Han Sen's stomach sank instantly. Empty God hadn't been able to get anything from Han Sen. But the god might try to collect wishes from the people around Han Senator Exquisite, and Li Kier would be easier to break. Han Sen put his worries into the small jade figure, so exquisite, and Li Kier could feel his worries and be wary. Exquisite and Li Kier felt Han Sen's concern, and so they asked what was going on. Han Sen told them about meeting Empty God, and advised them to remain wary. While the three of them were talking, Bauer climbed up the star tree. She was playing on the surface of a star fruit when suddenly, a man appeared on the branch next to her. "Little kid, do you want this?" Empty God was holding a beautiful gem. He smiled at Bauer and swung the gem around as he spoke to her. Han Sen had been right to expect that Empty God would target the people around him. But he had misjudged which person Empty God would go after. The god hadn't chosen Exquisite or Li Kier. He was aiming for the innocent Bauer. Bauer looked at the shining gem in Empty God's hands. Her eyes opened wide with surprise. Chapter 27:20 Star Gauge Mirror. "That is a very beautiful gem," Bauer said as she peered at the gem in Empty God's hand. Her eyes brightened with interest. Empty God's lips curled up at the corners. He looked cocky as he said, "Do you want it? Just say you want it, and it is yours." "Really?" Bauer looked surprised. She gazed at Empty God with disbelief. "Of course. As long as you say what you want. A cute little girl like you can have anything you've ever dreamed of," Empty God said chivalrously, his voice smooth and coaxing. "You're a great guy," Bauer said with excitement. Empty God laughed. He held the gem in front of Bauer and smiled. "Just say you want it, and this gem will then belong to you." Bauer looked longingly at the gem, and her hands slowly reached out for the gem. Empty God hid a snide smile as he thought to himself, "Female creatures are all alike. They are just like those ugly dragons. No matter how old they are, they love all things shiny." But Bauer suddenly pulled her hand back. With a look of disappointment, she said, "I actually don't want it." "What? Why do you suddenly not want it?" Empty God asked in surprise. He had been caught off guard when the girl changed her mind. "Mom says that I can't take gifts from strangers." Bauer's face looked very serious when she said this, but her eyes were still locked on the gem. It looked as if she was struggling to keep herself from reaching out and taking it. "I see," Empty God said with a smile. "You can't accept things from strangers, of course. But I'm not a stranger. I'm a good friend of your father. You can take something from me because of that, can't you?" "You are a good friend of my father?" Bauer asked, her eyebrows rising. "Yes, we are very, very good friends." When Empty God said that, the words he spoke were stressed. Each word was pronounced heavier than the last. "If you are Dad's good friend, then we really aren't strangers," Bauer said happily. "Of course we aren't," Empty God said with a shake of his head. "Thank you, Uncle. In that case, I'm going to take the gem." Bauer reached out her hand to grab the gem in Empty God's hands. As she reached toward it, Empty God wasn't sure if he should let it go or continue holding on to it. Bauer hadn't declared her wish yet. If she took it now, Empty God wouldn't receive anything in return. Empty God didn't respond, and Bauer stared at him with confusion. She said, "Uncle, do you not want to give me the gem? If that is so, then that is fine. Mom told me not to steal other people's items anyway." Bauer's words might have been gracious, but her face was filled with disdain. She thought Empty God was very cheap by not giving her the gem. Ahem ahem. You still haven't told me whether or not you want it, Empty God said. He was looking a bit uncomfortable now. Uncle, this gem is obviously important to you. You should keep it for yourself. With those words, Bauer lowered her hand and turned around to leave. Although she didn't say anything more, she had a look of scorn as she turned away. It made Empty God feel more depressed than he had in a long time. He was Empty God, but he was despised by a child. Don't go, Bauer. Your uncle was planning on giving you this gem as a gift. I wasn't in my right mind. You should take it from me now. Empty God didn't really care about the gem, and giving it to Bauer might allow him to gain her trust. He wasn't going to let her run off so easily. You are really going to give it to me? Aren't you going to miss it? Bauer looked wonderingly up at Empty God. To me, this gem is just a measly rock. It is worthless compared to the other things in my possession. Empty God placed the gem in Bauer's hands. Thank you, uncle. You are a good guy. Bauer held the gem and smiled. I'm glad you like it. Empty God smiled, but on the inside he was thinking, I was worried you wouldn't take it. Now that you've fallen into the habit of taking things that I offer, this should be easy. Bauer really liked the gem. She focused her attention on it carefully as she played with it. Empty God reached into his pocket and brought out another gem that was even bigger and prettier than the first. He said, Bauer, do you not think this gem is even prettier? Would you like it? Bauer looked at the gem in Empty God's hand. It was as large as a man's fist. She blinked at the sight of it and said, It is way too big. I'd feel rather snobby if I had it. I like this one more. After that, Bauer went back to playing with the gem in her hands, completely ignoring Empty God. Empty God felt depressed. He had assumed that offering a bigger and prettier gem would get Bauer to put blind faith in him. Instead, however, the gem had led to his abandonment. It looks like using gems to attract Bauer will no longer work. Empty God rolled his eyes and came up with something new. Bauer, look at this. Empty God stepped over to Bauer and pulled out something to show her. Bauer was sitting atop the star fruit, but she raised her head to take a look. Empty God was holding an old bronze mirror. The mirror was only 10 centimeters long, and it looked very delicate. The front was smooth and glossy. On the back of the mirror, lines spread from the center of the mirror to its edges, like a sundial or a compass. Strange symbols were etched in each space between the lines. What is this? Bauer asked Empty God with curiosity. The man was holding the mysterious mirror out so that she could see it. This is the star gauge mirror. It is a true God-class treasure. This device will allow you to see the past and the future, Empty God said, lavishing praises on the old mirror he was now presenting. Although he was embellishing what it was capable of, the mirror really was quite special. Empty God had wanted the mirror badly, and it had taken him a lot of time and effort to get his hands on it. Empty God and King June called themselves God, but they couldn't make something out of nothing. Everything that they could use or control already existed in the universe in some form. They couldn't just magically conjure up any item they wanted. That star gauge mirror was a precious treasure that had come from a true God elite who had lived 1 billion years ago. Empty God had struggled to lure that true God elite for hundreds of years before the elite fell into his trap. The elite made a wish, and Empty God stole the elite's lifespan. He also gained control of the star gauge mirror. Empty God was very proud of what he had accomplished. There had been another God that was also trying to trick the true God, but he had failed. Empty God had claimed the victory and the treasure. So, even though the mirror might have been useless, he still carried it around with him. Now it presented a perfect opportunity to trick Bauer. Is the mirror really that powerful? Bauer asked in disbelief. Of course it is. Just watch it, Empty God said. His hands pressed against the star gauge mirror, manipulating the symbols on the back. A flickering light appeared on the surface of the old mirror. After a while, the light resolved into a slightly unsteady image, like a show playing on an old TV. The star tree stood in the center of the image. There were a bunch of star beetles swarming over the tree like an ocean wave. Han Sun was fighting those star beetles. Upon closer inspection, Bauer realized that it was an image of Han's son participating in the test at the star tree. Chapter 27:21 A very disappointing item. Star gauge mirror is shining a light on the past. It can rewind time to reveal what occurred in days long gone. Empty God spoke in a mysterious voice, once again filled with confidence. The star gauge mirror wasn't useful for him, but its power was excellent nonetheless. It could rewind time, and that power alone made it exceedingly overpowered. However, Empty God and the many gods like him were always economical with the truth. The power of the star gauge mirror wasn't a lie, but there were limitations to what it could present. Normal people couldn't use the mirror on a whim as Empty God could. Of course, Empty God wasn't going to mention that to Bauer. He would only let Bauer see how amazing the star gauge mirror was in his own hands. Empty God studied Bauer's face as he showed off the mirror, hoping that she might exhibit some surprise. Bauer's eyes did widen as she watched the image playing across the star gauge mirror. But after watching it for a while, she was confused. She said, "Uncle, this power, in my home, can be achieved through something called a camcorder. We have many items that can showcase the past, like datapads and phones. There are also holograms and other similar gadgets. If you like them that much, then when we head into civilization, I will ask my father to get you the best camcorder money can buy. It will be much prettier than this one. The picture will be much clearer too. Think of it as a gift for giving me this gem." Bauer looked at him, as if she was looking at someone who was very out of touch with the modern world. Empty God felt a muscle in his cheek twitch. He wanted nothing more than to murder Bauer right there, but he held in his rage. Empty God was being very slow and patient. "This isn't a camcorder. You can rewind time. It can show you anything that happened in the past." "Is there a difference?" Bauer tilted her head, looking confused. Empty God opened his mouth to explain, but then he realized that it might be too hard of a concept for a child to understand. Time travel was a complicated subject, and explaining the difference between that and using a camcorder to record past events might be too difficult. "It is fine if you're not interested in this power. Star gauge mirror has a stronger ability." Empty God was having trouble reasoning with this child, so he went for a more exciting aspect of star gauge mirror to win her over. Empty God spun the compass-like dial on the back of the star gauge mirror, and the item began to shine with a wavering light. Moments later, the mirror was displaying a different image. The star tree stood in the center of the picture again, but there were no star beetles, and neither was there Han Senator in the video. There was a man who had a human body and a lion head. He was picking star fruit. But this time, the video was very short. The man picked fruit for a few seconds, and then the video vanished. "What was that all about?" Bauer asked with confusion. After striking a pose that was both mystical and aloof, Empty God answered, "This is the true power of the star gauge mirror. It reveals the future. The footage you have just seen is something that will happen in the near future. There will be a creature like the one you saw coming to collect star fruit soon. Everything you see in this mirror is the truth. It will come to pass." "Uncle, are you a movie director?" Bauer looked at Empty God. She blinked, looking curious. A muscle in Empty God's cheek spasmed. He suppressed his urge to kill the damn kid, and answered her. "Director? I didn't hire people to film this. I don't know who this creature is. This is the star gauge mirror, showing you what will happen in the future." "Ah, it can see the future? Its power is that magical?" Bauer finally looked surprised. She stared at the star gauge mirror in wide-eyed disbelief. Seeing Bauer's face, Empty God finally felt a bit better. He laughed and said, "This is one of the best true God items in existence. There is no other like it in the whole universe. Just say you want it, and I can give it to you." "Really, Uncle? You are such a good man." Bauer looked at Empty God with surprise. "You want it?" Empty God extended the star gauge mirror, holding it out in front of Bauer. But this time, he reassured himself that he wouldn't let her touch the mirror before she made a wish, just in case something embarrassing happened. Bauer opened her mouth. Judging from the expression on her face, it definitely seemed that she was about to express her desire for the mirror. This filled Empty God with joy. If Bauer spoke the 3 words, "I want it," then she would be making a wish to him. Then, he would gain control of her. And in regards to the star gauge mirror, he would no longer have to give it to her. There were many explanations for making someone's wish come true. An empty god already had several different excuses ready for use. But after Bauer opened her little mouth, she didn't say anything. She seemed to suddenly think of something, and she shut her mouth quickly. "What is it?" Empty God demanded, his heart sinking. Being forced to wait like this was like having an itch that he couldn't scratch. Bauer's face looked a little excited. She thought of something good and almost burst out laughing. Empty God looked at Bauer with confusion. He did not know what was so funny about this situation. It made him feel as if something was going on that he was completely oblivious to. "Uncle, this mirror can predict the future. Isn't that right?" Bauer asked, gripping her hands excitedly into fists. "Yeah," Empty God said with a nod. "In that case, it can predict the lottery numbers of the next universal lottery, right? It can win me prizes." Bauer looked at Empty God with excitement. Many races had lotteries, so Empty God was familiar with the concept. The most famous of those universal lotteries was operated by the 1,000 Treasures. The lottery tickets were cheap, but if someone won the top prize, they would earn billions of 1,000 Treasures coins. How much money was a billion of those coins? It would be enough to purchase a low-level deified treasure straight from the 1,000 Treasures. Right now, the universal lottery's price had gone up to $1 billion. Whoever won the prize could get all that money without paying any taxes. Throughout the years, many creatures had made wishes to Empty God concerning the universal lottery, and Empty God had various ways of getting them the jackpot. However, Star Gauge Mirror didn't have this function. The Star Gauge Mirror could only predict things that would happen in the specific location that it was used. In addition, the snippets of the future that it revealed were random. The user couldn't choose how far into the future they wanted to look. Empty God had no way of adding a power like this to the Star Gauge Mirror, so he was rendered speechless. "Uncle, have you never heard of the Big Universe Lottery? It is a small card with numbers on it. If you win the prize, you can buy lots and lots and lots of food and clothes." Bauer thought Empty God might not know about the universal lottery, so she tried to explain how it worked. "Star Gauge Mirror is a true God item. It has too much dignity to be used on something so lame," Empty God said. "You can't do it." Bauer looked disappointed. Then, she thought of something and asked, "Can it predict what will happen after Book 7 of Overbearing President Love Luov? Can I see that before it comes out?" "What the hell is that?" Empty God seemed entirely befuddled. "It is the work of a very famous comic author. He has a comic that is so good, but the author writes so slowly. There have only been 7 books. I want to see what happens next. Can Star Gauge Mirror predict it?" Bauer looked at Empty God hopefully. Empty God's head was full of black lines. Star Gauge Mirror couldn't do this. Even if the mirror could reveal the author working on his next comic, it wouldn't show much. Even in a best-case scenario, Bauer would get only a glance at the work. Chapter 27-22 Good Guy Uncle. "And you said this was a good item. It can't do this, it can't do that. What in the world is it for, then?" Bauer lifted her lips in a slight sneer as she spoke. "Can't do what? I'm offering you a true God item that can foretell the future. But all you want is to read comics and win the lottery." Empty God muttered bitterly. "The item itself is its own benefit. You can predict what is going to happen in a certain place in the future. That has nothing to do with me. If it doesn't let me get lots of delicious food and great-looking clothes, then it is useless to me." Bauer was no longer interested. She returned to playing on the star fruit, swinging her body around it. She no longer wanted to talk about it. This conversation was making Empty God feel terrible. The mirror was the treasure he most cherished, but Bauer had made it sound like a piece of worthless junk. It annoyed him, and he couldn't accept it. Kids really are the worst. Empty God was furious, but dealing with this child was probably still easier than dealing with Han's son would be. So he kept his rage in check. He wasn't going to leave just yet. "Bauer, don't go yet. I have only mentioned one part of the Star Gauge Mirror's power. There are actually many more things this can do, Empty God said. He did his best to remain patient. What powers does it have? Bauer asked with much reluctance. She really wasn't interested in continuing down this avenue of conversation. Empty God quickly said, "You will know it when you see. You're going to like it too." The glance that Bauer cast toward Empty God was filled with boredom. She had only replied to him out of simple politeness. Upon seeing Bauer's expression, Empty God knew that he would really have to knock it out of the park this time. Otherwise, it would be difficult to deal with the naughty kid any longer. Lifting the star gauge mirror once again, Empty God started to look a bit more serious. He had been treating Bauer as a kid, not believing she was all that important. But Bauer had reacted in ways that he hadn't expected. She had thrown him off his game, and that made him take this matter a little more gravely. He brushed the back of the mirror with his fingers, which set the compass spinning again. Light appeared from the surface of the mirror and shone on Bauer. It turned Bauer's cowboy clothing into a shiny set of armor. Wow! So powerful. When Bauer saw the armor she was now wearing, she couldn't help but squeal in delight. When Empty God saw Bauer's sudden happiness, he started to behave a bit more cockily again. He turned the star gauge mirror in his hands and said, "This is the star gauge mirror's mirror armor power. It can make your armor's defense deified." Bauer looked as if she really admired her new wardrobe, and Empty God was about to show off the mirror's mirror armor power some more. Before he could continue, Bauer walked over in front of Empty God. She stared at the star gauge mirror and said, "It is so powerful. I can change my outfit in the blink of an eye. This is a good item for changing clothes. With this clothes-changing mirror, I won't have to wash my clothes or change them myself anymore. Using this mirror, I'll be able to change how I'm dressed with ease. This is so good." Empty God's expression darkened. The child before him was incomprehensible. The star gauge mirror could show the future and gift its user with extreme defensive qualities. But she didn't seem to care about any of that. All she cared about was the fact that she could change clothes. Still, it was lucky I've got her on the line, Empty God thought with a wry smile. He went on to say to her, "You like it? Just tell me that you want it, and I will give it to you. You can always use the armor. You can always use it to change clothes." "Can I change my clothes into the dress of a beautiful princess? I love princess dresses, but Daddy thinks they are annoying. He doesn't let Bauer wear them," Bauer said, her expression forlorn and downtrodden. Empty God once more found himself at a loss for words. Luring this child was proving to be more difficult than tempting an old evil behemoth that had lived for 1,000,000,000 years. Those ancient creatures would at least have some sense. Empty God could guess what they wanted and needed, but after all this time talking to little Bauer, he still couldn't figure out how her mind worked. "I can't. Then that is a shame. If I can only let me change into one set of clothes, then there's no point. That would be pretty boring." Bauer looked very disappointed. Empty God was on the verge of giving up. Tricking Han's son suddenly seemed easier than dealing with this little girl any longer. Empty God thought about it for a bit, then decided that he should just change targets. He had no idea why Han's son was keeping Bauer as a companion, but there was no reason for him to waste his time with a naughty kid that had a mind that could not be understood. Lifting the star gauge mirror and shining it on Bauer once more, Empty God removed Bauer's armor and returned her cowboy clothing to her. "Don't move," Bauer shouted at Empty God, her eyes suddenly wide. "What is it?" Empty God remained stock still. Bauer's face turned from shock to pleased surprise. Then she flew toward Empty God and said, "This is so awesome. How can this mirror be so good?" While she was talking, Bauer jumped in front of the star gauge mirror and stared into it happily. "What do you mean by powerful?" Empty God still didn't understand what Bauer was talking about. He hadn't triggered any of the star gauge mirror's powers. It shouldn't have been doing anything right now, but based on the shocked expression on Bauer's face, it really did look as if she had discovered something awesome. "Do you not see it? This mirror is awesome. Here, look." While Bauer was talking, she had already put her hands on the star gauge mirror. After Bauer's continual rejection of the second gem, and now his precious star gauge mirror, Empty God actually became excited when she appeared to show genuine interest in the item. He let her pull the mirror out of his hand, curious about what she had discovered. Bauer was holding the star gauge mirror and examining it closely. She mumbled over and over, "This is awesome. This mirror is so awesome. What is so awesome about it?" Empty God put his head next to Bauer's to try to figure out what she was seeing. He could see the mirror, perfectly polished as always, but there was nothing special going on. He could detect no weird powers within the item. It was acting just like it had when it was lying around without any active powers. He really couldn't tell what Bauer found so enthralling. "Uncle, haven't you noticed? This mirror doesn't show my face," Bauer said while looking at the mirror. Empty God wanted to laugh as much as he wanted to cry, and he said, "Of course you cannot see yourself. This is not an average mirror. The mirror is incredibly powerful. And unless you have a power greater than that of the mirror, it will not show your reflection. Therefore, you cannot see a reflection in it as you currently are." "This is awesome. Dad told me only vampires don't have reflections. Now that I don't have a reflection, Daddy will be so shocked." Bauer exulted. She wrapped the star gauge mirror in her arms, bowed to Empty God and shouted, "Thank you, Uncle. You really are a very good man. You have given me such awesome treasures. I'm buying you lunch." After that, Bauer leaped off the tree, still holding the star gauge mirror. She ran forward shouting, "Dad! Dad! Look! I have a very awesome treasure. A good uncle gave it to me." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.